Bom dia a todo mundo, bem-vindos ao nosso workshop. Como vocês sabem, ele vai ser apresentado em inglês, então eu vou mudar também para o modo inglês, se os nossos convidados sabem do que eu estou falando. So, welcome to our Cultural Evolution workshop. 25 years ago, I was a biologist who went for a doctoral degree in psychology because I was interested in the study of animal behavior. As a young professor, though, I was mostly involved with cognitive development in human children when I agreed to supervise an undergrad student experiment on tool-use problem solving by capuchin monkeys. One day, that student, she told me that as she returned from the island where those semi-captive monkeys were kept, she heard some banging sounds from the woods, from the forested area in that urban park, where another group of capuchins lived in semi-freedom. And she was told by the park keeper that that's the capuchin monkeys cracking nuts with stones. As a researcher on human cognitive development, I was fascinated by chimpanzees, our closest relatives, but I was not that interested on, not acknowledged with, New World primates. That day, though, our lab's main research line changed for good. After our original findings about tool use by the semi-free monkeys, we expanded our research to wild populations, and we found that percussive tool use was the rule among savanna capuchin populations, even though spontaneous use of probe tools has been so far only observed in a single population in Serra da Capivara. With these findings, we brought the tufted capuchin monkeys to the so-called field of cultural primatology. So, the notion of cultured animals was already old in certain contexts, as in the works of Imanishi, the pioneer of Japanese primatology, and the research on the spread of new food processing techniques among Japanese monkeys. Long-term studies with wild chimpanzee populations revealed not only an unexpected social complexity, but also an interpopulational variability in behavioral repertoires, including something considered exclusive and defining of human nature, the use of tools. And an interpopulation variability that did not seem fully explainable by genetic or by ecological differences. In 1992, Bill McGrew used the term material culture to talk about chimpanzee tools. And later on, White and colleagues examined the observed behavioral variation, not only tool use, between 6 long-term studied chimpanzee populations, excluding cases explainable by ecological or genetic difference, and found many candidates to social traditions. And then, a bit later, through studies by Carol Van Chaik and colleagues, we learned about the use of tools by wild orangutans to extract honey or seeds. And orangutans are not exactly the most gregarious apes, but interestingly, the use of tools was only observed where the ecology favored typically large groups of females and immatures. The comparative method in itself, though, as noted Fragesi, does not directly examine the social biases in the acquisition of behavioral variants, which defines traditions and culture. So it's important to complement it with developmental studies or experimental diffusion experiments. In the case of our capuchins, we found that stone tool use to crack nuts slowly develops from the inept manipulation of nuts and rocks by the infants along the first 3 years of life. It takes a long time. And it's easy to perceive the importance of infant curiosity and their selectivity of observational targets on the one hand, and adult males' tolerance to close observation and scrounging on the other. Also, spontaneous innovation seldom happen when we are looking, but we can experimentally induce them, follow the diffusion, and employ statistical tools such as MBDA to tell apart social and asocial factors in their diffusion. It's something that I am not sure, but probably Rachel Kendall will talk some more about today. As the range of known socially learned behaviors among primate species widened, cultural primatology, in Duval's words, came of age. Ethology and comparative psychology have long studied in human and non-human animals the process in which the acquisition of individual knowledge is mediated directly or indirectly by interactions with other individuals. And we became more and more familiarized with the process of transgenerational transmission of behavioral patterns by socially biased learning in a broad range of species, from communication and birdsong or cetacean dialects to tool use and other foraging techniques. And Andy White will talk more to you about that soon. The idea of social learning as an adaptation goes back to the founding fathers of evolutionary theory. And socially biased learning can be based on very elementary process in terms of cognitive demands, such as facilitation and stimulus enhancement, or more sophisticated mechanisms like imitation or deliberate learning, deliberate teaching, some apparently restricted to humans. However, while our impressions of the uniqueness of human culture focus on these noble processes, naturalistic and experimental studies have shown that behavioral traditions of non-human primates can be perpetuated through the simplest socially biased learning mechanisms. But all those notions about animal cultures collide with the standard definition of culture, which basically still reflects that proposed by Taylor in 1871, where culture was something explicitly restricted to humans. It's part of the definition. And that was an uncharted notion for a long time, in part due to the lesser role of cultural process in the mainstream biological thought. The evolutionary model proposed by Darwin is organized around three very broad concepts: variation, selection, and inheritance. In this context, it was possible to conceive processes such as group selection or the Lamarckian inheritance of traits achieved along individuals' lifetimes, something that the inheritance mechanisms imagined by Darwin did not rule out. Then the subsequent developments of evolutionary biology, from the incorporation of Mendelian genetics, followed by successive advances in the knowledge about cell structure and division, the discovery of chromosomes, and the architecture and functioning of DNA, along with development of mathematical modeling of population genetics, qualified and delimited the meanings of variation, inheritance, and selection, resulting in a model more and more focused in the genes as units of selection. But under such perspective, individual developmental process lost much of the evolutionary relevance, as you can see in the classic Weismann barrier. It pointed to the isolation between information contained in the germline cell and the life history of the somatic cells, eliminating thus the possibility of a molecular Lamarckian inheritance. So the evolutionary role of developmental events like cultural processes seem restricted to the proximate effects on the fitness of the vehicles, the individual organisms, in the production of copies of the replicators, the genes. And then social biology, as an extension of the neo-Darwinian model to the field of the evolution of sociality, based the classic evolutionary approaches to human behavior, such as evolutionary psychology and human behavioral ecology, which is also known as evolutionary anthropology. And evolutionary psychology, for instance, has emphasized a focus on human cognitive adaptations. From this perspective, culture is understood as the product of the expression of these individual adaptations in social interaction. And Richard Dawkins proposed an analogy or a metaphor between the mechanisms underlying the propagation of genes and of cultural ideas, and he coined the term meme to define a replicator whose reproductive success would be associated to the occupation of the largest possible number of vehicles, in this case, brains. And Dawkins' dog was very emphatic. The meme's fitness would take place in the space of cultural competition among memes, without presupposing implications for genetic selection beyond those proximal effects as part of an extended phenotype. The Journal of Memetics was gone in 2005, and memetics, in the strict sense, did not constitute an actually very fruitful line of research. And that's mostly because the gene meme analogy is a bit more complicated than it seems at first glance. What's a meme? Are memes the ideas that jump from brain to brain, or are memes the ideas plus the behavior or cultural expressions that mediate this jump, which are the phenotypes or the genotypes in this case? And this relative disdain of the neo-Darwinian approach for the role of cultural process in evolution has had several consequences, including allowing a disregard of part of the humanities for comparative perspectives on culture, whose definitions continue to reflect that of Tyler, explicitly restricted to humans. So, and creating monsters like the nature against nurture dichotomy. To move on, we need to start with a less biased, more operational definition of culture, like that of Leyland and Hopp 2003, according to which cultures are those group-typical behavioral patterns shared by members of a community that rely on socially learned and transmitted information. Cultural evolution hardly fits neo-Darwinian assumptions for several reasons. First, the sources of variation are not random, like genetic mutations. Innovations may involve components of chance, but they tend to be channeled by concrete motivations, and their diffusion depends on cognitive and social biases of context and content, without which cultural evolution would possibly be unviable, such as frequency biases, conformity to more frequent behavioral variants in the group, or model-based biases like prestige, age, or hierarchy biases. Perhaps Rachel will talk more about this learning strategies. And in addition, cultural inheritance can flow through the population not only through vertical pathways from parent to child, but also oblique when learned from other adults, for instance, with recognized expertise, or horizontal pathways in the case of more recent knowledge, such as new techniques learned from peers or passing fads. And finally, Dawkins' analogy may be less simple than it seems when we try to delimit those, as I said, cultural replications. Memes are not particularly particulated as genes, or to examine the status of the artifacts in cultural transmissions, such as books or temples, which could also be seen as vehicles in addition to the meme-infested brains. However, on many fronts, evolutionary approaches to the examination of the dynamics of process of cultural evolution have flourished from the concepts of evolutionary biology, such as selection, mutation, and drift, and employing mathematical models derived largely from population genetics and game theory. All it takes for a process to be Darwinian is inheritable variation and selection. So cultural evolution can be Darwinian, even though not neo-Darwinian. The reevaluation of ontogenetic processes, including culture in evolutionary dynamics, takes place in a context that involves other transgressive ideas in relation to some canons of neo-Darwinian synthesis. One of them is niche construction. In the modern synthesis view, adaptation happens fundamentally by natural selection, which adjusts organisms to a pre-existing environment. In Williams' words, adaptation is always asymmetrical because organisms adapt to the environment, never vice versa. This foundation, however, has always been the subject of question. Good, for example, criticized the overemphasis on natural selection to the detriment of other mechanisms, such as genetic drift, pleiotropies, and philo or ontogenetic constraints, leading to a suboptimality of the organisms that the Panglossianism of the adaptionist program would not contemplate. Lewanti, in turn, postulates that organisms do not adapt to their environments. They construct them out of the bits and pieces of the external world. This kind of vision led to the concept of niche construction, which was coined by Odlin Smee and developed in collaboration with Leyland and Feldman, which proposes that organisms change the environment through their behavior and thus change the selective pressures acting on their own and other species. And it's interesting to notice that this notion was already suggested in Darwin's studies on earthworms, which alter the texture of the soil to live in conditions more suitable for descendants of aquatic worms. This concept, in turn, leads to that of an ecological inheritance, the transmission of organisms to future generations, not only of their genes, but of transformed environments, either in stabilizing ideal conditions, as termites do by means of their nests, by changing the landscapes, as beaver dams, migrating to new geographic regions, manipulating other species, or by polluting the biosphere with non-biodegradable waste. That's our species inheritance, environmental inheritance. In the human case, at least, the size and impact of this process makes it possible to speak of cultural niche selection, with an interconnected role of the three domains of information acquisition: genetic, ontogenetic, and cultural. In Leyland's words, niche construction theory is explicit about the need to treat niche construction as both a developmental process and a cause of evolution. These discussions point to the need for rescue of the evolutionary importance of ontogenetic process, a perception that is consolidated in the so-called evolutionary developmental biology, Evo-Devo, in its conception of development as an object of natural selection and also as an agent in the establishment of innovations that can result in evolutionary relevant consequences by exposing organisms to altered selective pressures. So the idea of a potential two-way street between the two forms of transgenerational transmission of information, genetics and culture, gained strength as concrete cases were studied in which human cultural practices apparently promoted process of rapid genetic selection. Taken together, the reconsideration of the evolutionary role of cultural process has resulted in the concept of gene-culture coevolution, as independent but interdependent processes with properties not necessarily identical but converging on several fundamental aspects. Among the classic examples are the increased frequency of sickle cell anemia alleles in yam growers in Africa, because deforestation for agriculture has promoted conditions for further malaria dissemination, and altered red blood cells in the case of heterozygosis are less parasitized. It's better to be a little anemic than dead by malaria. Mutations neutralizing gene silencing for lactase production, which is normal for mammals after weaning in pastoralist populations, so we can drink milk as adults. Or another example, the effects of social grouping because of sign language users on gene frequencies for hereditary deafness. And in this context, we should include also the culture intelligence hypothesis in its various versions, restricted not to humans, which consider that as a species becomes increasingly dependent on socially biased learning or cultural processes, this dependence would determine some degree, this dependence would determine selective pressures favoring any traits cognitive abilities or social motivations with some degree of genetic causation that enable, facilitate, or optimize the processes of cultural transmission and assimilation of innovations. So when we think of culture as a broader natural phenomenon, the debate is refined by examining the extent to which the explosive cultural evolution of the human species is based on fundamental differences, qualitative and not just quantitative, from cultural processes in other species, and according to which social and or cognitive particulars. In this scenario, the discussion about the eminently cumulative nature of human culture stands out. But to what extent do different mechanisms enable different forms of culture? Well, the ability to adopt a more efficient technical variant would, for authors such as Tomasello, be directly associated with a refined understanding of the motivational processes underlying the behavior of the model by a learner, and the model's understanding of the lack of knowledge of the learner, both requiring the ability to represent intentionality, known as, in this case, as the theory of mind, eventually supplemented by behavioral predispositions for the use of attentional markers that optimize teaching, for instance, as what Zibra and Gergely called a natural pedagogy. The interactions between the evolution and the ontogeny of cultural learning will further be discussed with you this afternoon by Professor Christine Leguer. But what about cumulative culture in humans? There is little naturalistic or experimental evidence so far. But there are many potential approaches to the study of cultural evolutionary process in humans. Evolutionary anthropologists have attempted to update the ethnographic method with modern statistical techniques to determine the relative influence of vertical, oblique, or horizontal transmission in determining cultural beliefs, abilities, knowledge, or the ecological and or demographical determinants of cultural complexity from real historical cases such as the Tasmanians' supposed lack of some technologies case, to virtual group tasks in lab experiments, where you simulate the cultural development of tools by different size groups. Cultural microevolution experiments aim to simulate, under controlled conditions, process of information transmission and transformation, exploring cognitive biases that can degrade or enhance information or techniques transmitted along linear or open diffusion chains, with gradual replacement of individuals from successive generations, and the possibility of limiting the different pathways of information flow, where you can imitate, emulate their teaching, and experiments like those by Christine Caldwell, who will talk a lot more about it soon, simulated such process of cultural evolution in the laboratory, investigating exactly the role of different socially mediated learning mechanisms in the development of cultural processes, increasingly better paper airplanes, higher and higher spaghetti towers, and really much more about this. So to conclude, the new Darwinian model, strictly speaking, relegated culture to a lesser role in the broader scenario of biological evolution. On the other hand, the classic Darwinian model is much simpler and broader and determined by referring to inheritable variation with differential consequences in terms of reproductive success or fitness. Evolution through cycles of variation, inheritance, and selection are not only applicable but intuitively associated with cultural processes. And this implies the possibility that evolutionary models and concepts such as those derived from population dynamics may be useful for understanding the evolution of culture, provided we are not bound by a strict analogy between genes and memes and given the due consideration to the underlying psychological and social processes. In the optimistic perception of authors such as Alex Besudi, a Darwinian paradigm can be useful tool to promote a greater interaction between the social and the biological sciences. A potentially serious implication of the Darwinian approach to culture lies in the possible rehabilitation of ideas about group selection. The new Darwinian paradigm, with its focus on the gene as a unit of selection, exterminated simplistic traditional views on the adaptive value of behaviors for the good of species. And much of the new synthesis, theoretical elaboration, and mathematical modeling sought precisely to explain human cooperation in terms of inclusive fitness and kin selection, and subsequently the evolution of possible reciprocity strategies among the less related, and the cognitive framework to implement them. But the intrinsic peculiarities of the dynamics of cultural transmissions, for various reasons, such as biases of conformity, reducing intragroup variability, and process of intergroup cultural assimilation, make the possibility of group cultural selection processes much more plausible. Though the study of processes to some extent supposedly ignored or undervalued by the paradigm of the modern new Darwinian synthesis, such as niche construction or gene-culture coevolution, as well as molecular phenomena such as epigenetic molecular inheritance, with a consequent appreciation of the role of ontogenetic development in the evolutionary process, led to the proposition by some authors of the need for an extended Darwinian synthesis, but this is an extreme view that's quite controversial. On the other hand, the prospect of a dialogue creating bridges and possibilities for the conceptual integration between areas of the social and biological sciences in the study of culture has shown very concrete and promising fruits and allowed productive and intellectually stimulated interdisciplinary approaches. Questions regarding models of cultural evolution in a broader perspective, not restricted to human cultural processes, although often precisely seeking for the critical differences, motivated increasingly frequent conferences around these topics. And it recently led to the creation of a new scientific society, the Cultural Evolution Society, which held its inaugural conference in 2017 in Vienna, Germany, and whose keynote was precisely to optimize the inclusion and interaction of the various theoretical and applied perspectives focused on the study of cultural phenomena from the humanities to the natural and the information sciences. The Cultural Evolution Society is one of the sources of funding for this workshop, whose speakers I have the pleasure and honor to present now, including the current president of the society, Rachel Kendall, and Christine Leguer, which will join us in the afternoon. Christine Caldo will talk to you quite soon. Rachel Kendall will close our workshop, but right now I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Andrew Whiten, which dispense presentations. I guess most of you have known his work since the seminal Machiavellian Intelligence. So, Andy.
Okay, well, while Adu's getting the slides up, let me just say good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here on your beautiful campus. And I'd like to start by thanking Edu for organizing this conference and inviting me and the other speakers to this workshop. I called my talk The Discovery of Animal Culture. And this is now a 70-year story. before that 70 years, I think the common view, and we've already heard this really from Edu, was that culture was a distinctively human characteristic. And I'll illustrate that by a quotation, which is actually only half a century old, from a very eminent biologist, Sir Peter Medawar, Nobel Prize winner, and in an article in the New York Review of Books in 1977, he was saying that human beings owe their biological supremacy, by which I think he means, we dominate the planet, to the possession of a form of inheritance quite unlike that of other animals. Exogenetic, beyond genetics, or exosomatic, beyond the body, kind of inheritance. And he went on, in this form of heredity, information is transmitted from one generation to the next through non-genetic inheritance, in general by the entire apparatus of culture. And of course, we are a distinctively cultural species. Culture permeates every aspect of our lives, the way we dress, our technology, our communications, languages, our architecture, our customs. But this research over the last 70 years, I think, has shown that it's not true to say that this second form of inheritance that Edu's already been telling us about is unique to humans. In the form of social learning, it seems to be quite widespread in animals, although it takes many different forms and levels of complexity. As Edu mentioned, one of my contributions was this paper, and I want to just illustrate the reaction already, or rather still there, in the year 1999 to our publication of this paper. I'll explain a bit more about what this study said, for those of you who don't know, shortly. But our conclusion, I'll jump to, was that chimpanzees may have as many as 39 different traditions spread across Africa, to some extent mimicking the fact that, of course, human cultures are different across Africa and other parts of the world. Well, that created quite a response in the media. I had an email from a colleague in the United States to say, you won't believe it, but your research is on the front page of the New York Times. Now the whole world knows about your research. And I thought that was a particularly kind of North American view of the world, is the New York Times. But of course, he was right, because there was this article on the front page. Chimpanzees doing not what comes naturally, but what comes culturally. And it went on inside as well. Look, all this text. You scarcely see that now in popular science reporting, I think, in the media, sadly. But this was by Nathalie Ongier, a really well-researched piece. But what was more extraordinary was that there was an editorial. The editor said, no, we have to say something about this. And here's what they said. Chimpanzees with culture. Shock horror. After examining the results of 151 years of chimpanzee research, well, of course, we hadn't been studying chimpanzees for 150 years, but at all those 6 long-term study sites, if you add it together, there was 151 years by the time we synthesized those results. We concluded that certain behavioral variations among groups of chimpanzees could only be called cultural. Okay. But then, later on, it said the case of the cultural chimpanzees is, for some people, particularly troubling. Oh, because it blurs a boundary that seemed especially clear-cut, almost sacred. Well, I guess this is the USA. Whenever it suggested, it goes on, whenever it suggested that evolution has played a critical part in shaping the details of human behavior, controversy erupts. And I know there are evolutionary psychologists in the field that know perhaps that's all often true. We like to believe instead that culture, the arena of our freedom, according to the New York Times, I think we might sometimes regard it as a prison. But anyway, that's the main determinant of human behavior. And the faith that cultural variation is unique to humans has perhaps softened the theory of evolution, that dangerous theory, because it seemed to suggest that humans were liberated in a behavioral, if not a biological sense, from evolution's rigor, separate from Darwinian evolution. So they were saying what we've discovered is something that was believed to be a solely human attribute. Well, they were already by this time decades out of date. As Edu has already mentioned, the field of social learning and animal culture had got going earlier. And I'm just going to run quickly through 3 foundational studies I think it's important to recognize. And this was already a half century before this editorial in the New York Times. One line of research was on these little birds, blue tits and great tits, living in Britain and other parts of Europe, that almost a century ago learned to open milk bottles by peeling off the foil tops and then taking the cream that was underneath. And these reports were submitted to journals like British Birds by amateur ornithologists. They were just observations, anecdotes sent in. But what Fisher and Hine did was to collate them together over a number of years and show that, to begin with, they were really just occurring in 2 centres, one down near London here and another in the north of England. And then over time, they started to spread, and over a 12-year period, they spread over much of Britain, and they seemed to do that from these 2 initial centres. That's clearly far too quick to be a genetic change. It must be some other kind of learned change, and because of the way it diffused, it was inferred that this must be socially transmitted. So that was one example. The other example also comes from birds, so we haven't got to primates yet, but this was important research on bird song. William Thorpe in Cambridge studied these chaffinches, and they naturally have a song like this. I think you're going to hear it. When we tried it earlier, it was quite loud, so okay. And ornithologists divide that up into 3 sections. It's kind of hierarchically structured, and it looks and sounds like this. A series of what's called a terminal flourish at the end there. And some of the chaffinches that Bill Thorpe studied were what are called wild type. They were reared with other chaffinches in the aviary there. But the important experiment he did was to also rear some of these birds by themselves. So they had no opportunity to learn anything from other chaffinches. And they sang, but it was a different and less structured song. So we can look at the sonogram, which shows you what it looks like in terms of frequency over time, and you'll see a number of different calls, but it doesn't have that 3-part structure, if you can try and hear that, and it doesn't have that terminal flourish at the end. So we listen to what these isolate birds did, and then hear the wild type again, I hope. Whereas the wild type sounds like this, I hope. And so the importance of this, I think, is it's showing that we can do very neat experiments to definitely demonstrate social learning. You have one condition in which there's a model who can be learned from, another condition in which there isn't a model, and if there's a difference between the results of that, then we know we've got social learning occurring. So these were important laboratory experiments, but then they could be coupled with research that came out also in the 1960s by people like Peter Mahler, showing that in the wild, birds in different regions sing different variations on the song. They sing what came to be called different dialects, much as in Brazil, they have different dialects in the language across different regions. I'm going to show you an illustration from a more recent study, about 2000 or so, but I think you can see from those sonograms, they're probably all recognizable as, what are they, white-crowned sparrow songs, but they vary, and they vary in systematic ways across the region. And in a recent book review, this paper could reference about over 80 different studies showing these kind of dialect differences. And if you think how many birds are songbirds, well, it looks as if there are thousands of species showing this kind of cultural phenomenon. But then, of course, there were primates, and we've already heard from Edu that these researchers by the Japanese on the Japanese monkey were foundational because they were fed sweet potatoes, which became sandy on the beach where they were provisioned. But one juvenile, Emo, worked out you could take them into the stream and wash the sand off. And if we put a monkey like that into Emo's position there, well, there's her family drawn out there and the other genealogies in her group, and all the ones with squares around them, with rectangles around them, are the monkeys that later picked this up. So this behavior definitely diffused, and it was interesting that it diffused along the lines of first being picked up by her peers, the juveniles she played with most, and then it spread to their mothers, and then once the mothers got it, it spread to all their subsequent offspring. So you could trace the diffusion pathway, and as Edu says, more recent studies, I'll mention another one later, with more systematic modern statistics are able to trace that very well. So that was, I think, 3 of the foundations, but then we had half a century more research on various different species, demonstrating social learning traditions and these kind of cultural phenomena in many different species. Apes became important because I think they produced a kind of step change in our notion of what animal cultures might consist of. And Jane Goodall started her research in the 1960s, but by 1973 she was already talking about cultural elements in a chimpanzee community. And one major basis for her inferring that was simply the way in which juveniles, like Fifi here, watching her mother Flo termite fishing, pay such really close attention to what the adults are doing, and then over time they start to practice these and eventually perfect them. Well, that was perhaps a bit premature, or perhaps it was just a far-reaching insight that this might be social learning, because other researchers have suggested, well, perhaps she's just really wanting to scrounge some of the termites. You can't say, as this label to the figure does, social learning, just because of the way she looks. Perhaps she has other goals. But more recent studies have shown other interesting correlational evidence that suggests that really this is important social learning. Elizabeth Lonsdorf studied chimpanzees, young chimpanzees, watching their mothers termiting like this, and found that females are much more avid observers of what goes on. Their male peers are much more likely to be doing something like play fighting in the bushes. You might say they have some kind of attention deficit to this kind of behavior. And then, sure enough, the female chimpanzees master the process of termite fishing about a whole year ahead of the males who hadn't been attending so closely to what was going on. So that supports Jane Goodall's inferences, I would suggest. And then, a few years later, we had the first evidence of a social custom. So everything I've talked about so far has been to do with communication or foraging. And here we have the social custom of 2 males holding hands above their heads and then grooming underneath, which Bill McGrew and Caroline Tutin realized was really quite common. It was customary in the Harley Mountains, but just a short distance away, really, along the lakeside where you get to the Gombe Stream Reserve where Jane Goodall worked, no one had actually seen it. That's why they realized there was a difference there. They'd already been there, not seen it, and so this was quite a dramatic difference. And to that were added the first discoveries that there were differences in the behavior of chimpanzees across Africa. And putting the whole story together, those were suspected to be cultural, so that by the time that Jane Goodall put together the Chimpanzees of Gombe, this wonderful, great volume, she then started to tabulate in the columns the different study sites, and in the rows all the different behaviors, and in the cells there the variations. So here are some blown up so you can just get an idea of what's involved there. And this process went on. Edu's already put this book up, so now we have a whole book level analysis of what came to be called chimpanzee material culture. I put a photograph of Bill McGrew along with me in an earlier phase where we all had more hair than we do now, at a sort of fancy Royal Society event where we were presenting this material. But there's McGrew resplendent in his McGrew kilt. And he's now joined us in St Andrews, I'm pleased to say. So here's a table from his book, and you can see again all the columns of the different regions and all the different behaviours starting to stack up there, and the X's, they're happening some places, and yet mysteriously, other than culture, not elsewhere. And these are all my scribbles on it, because this was the point at which I started to get interested in this, part because Mike Tomasello had invited me to review the field. And I thought, yes, it's all very suggestive of culture, but all these tables, and here's yet another one from Bertrand Tomasello himself, have various problems. And those are largely arise from the fact that they were just based on what was in the published literature. So I think there are three limitations in these charts that we're building up. One is that, not every observation is published. And more importantly, perhaps, the frequency, even if they get a kind of plus in one of these tables, we want to know really, are they really customary, are they habitual in this group? Is it a group characteristic? And then perhaps equally important, is it absent in some other places? And yet, of course, that's often not published. There's not many of us build our careers by publishing papers, well, we haven't seen this behavior at our research site, or we haven't seen this, or we haven't seen that. So what I persuaded my co-authors in this paper to do, and these were all the leaders of the long-term research groups, was to pool their information, published and unpublished, in a systematic way to see, okay, how clear can we be about our present understanding of what the cultural variation might be. So this was a two-phase study. First of all, we simply said, well, suggest what you think might be cultural variants, things that are common at your place and you've heard don't happen elsewhere, or the other way around. They're common somewhere and in 30 years you've never seen them. And that gave us a list of 65 candidates. So we carefully defined those and then gave them back to the research groups and said, now you have to classify each of those for your sites as are they behaviors which everybody knows are customary, done by pretty much everybody, or at least habitual, done repeatedly by several individuals, perhaps a subculture, or importantly, are they absent? With, or most interestingly, without, as far as we could see, any ecological environmental explanation, such as, well, they're not happening because the raw materials that are available elsewhere aren't available at my site. And that then pruned down the 65 candidates to the 39 we concluded were putative cultural variants or traditions. And each of these panels shows the 39 possibilities. They're lit up as squares if they're customary, circles at least if they're habitual, and they're grayed out if they're absent. Some of them have these little no entry signs saying, well, it couldn't happen there anyway for environmental reasons, but not too many of those. And so the two important conclusions from this, I think, was that there are multiple and very diverse traditions spanning pretty much the whole range of chimpanzee behaviors, the way they process their foods, various aspects of tool use, some aspects of social behavior, even the way they groom each other, and courtship gambits. And so what happened here, I think, was different from what had gone before. I mentioned those other instances, which were typically just one behavior and one tradition. Here we've got the second inference, that we've got communities that display unique whole arrays of traditions across a variety of behaviors. So what that means is that if you watch a chimpanzee for long enough and you can tick off several behaviors, you can tell where that chimpanzee comes from on the basis of its cultural profile alone, as of course we can often do for humans. If we see a human dressed in a particular way, eating a particular kind of food with particular utensils, speaking in a certain kind of way, we can probably tell, they come from some traditional Japanese community or whatever. So for chimpanzees was what the conclusion was here. Well, that's all well and good, but there is at least one important inherent weakness in all of this. It's all purely observational research. Perhaps when we're saying, well, we can't see any environmental explanation for why nutcracking happens there and nutcracking doesn't happen there, there are nuts in both places, but perhaps we've missed some subtle environmental explanation. So what one would really do, what one would really want to do, certainly I would as an experimentalist, is to do an experiment, ideally a field experiment. So you might take chimpanzees from here, where they do nutcracking, you've already heard about in Capuchins, and parachute them into East Africa here. And so, put them with other chimpanzees and then say, well, does nut cracking spread? At least scientifically, that in principle, that would be the experiment one might want to do. But you can imagine that's not very practical. It's not very ethical either. And so what we've done is complement these studies with captive experiments with captive chimpanzees, and I'm going to show you a couple of those. We've now managed to turn it round and get back into the field with field experiments. Not exactly like the one I described here, but other field experiments. And for me, that's the ultimate approach that one would like to have. But with captive chimpanzees, we'd have a situation here where we've got two groups of chimpanzees, the circles, who don't have any sight of the other ones. We present them all the same problem, and it's a problem we've tried to make analogous to what they have to face in the wild. A piece of food, or some food they really want, in this case it's a grape, and it's stuck behind a blockage. They can't get at it. And what we do is take one chimpanzee out, separate them, and show them that you can solve this by lifting the blockage up, by pushing your stick tool out of the cage and lifting the blockage up like this. Not something that chimpanzees would naturally do. But there's a little flap here. And in this group of chimpanzees, we take one chimpanzee out and show it a completely different way to solve the problem. To put your stick in that flap, push the blockage backwards, knock the grape off the back so the grape rolls forward, and you get it. So here now we have two experts who know how to solve this task, but in two very different ways. And we had a third group who had no such informed individual who didn't learn to do it. But here we've got two individuals who know how to do it. We then reunite that expert with the rest of the group, and we call this an open diffusion kind of experiment. It's open to who can come and watch and whether anyone does anything. So it's quite naturalistic in that way. And of course the question is, do those two different behaviors we've seeded there in one individual, it was in each case a high-ranking female, do they then spread to the rest of the group? Well, they did. But before I actually show you the data for that, and having introduced the idea, I'm going to move on to one further experiment, which is rather more complicated, but ask whether traditions will spread not only within a group, but even from group to group. And of course, that's important to test, because the inference is that in the wild, where we find, for example, something like nut cracking spread right across some quite large region of West Africa, but absent in the rest of Africa, our inference is that it spread across those communities by social learning. So here we were testing that, whether chimpanzees have the capacity to transmit in that way. So here we have three groups who can actually see the neighbouring groups through big windows here. You can probably see the windows down at the bottom here. And we have three other groups who can see their neighbours through their big windows, but they can't see the other group. And again, we have a task, which is the same task, but two different ways to solve it. You can open a hatch here, stab your stick in, stab the food, pull it out. Or you can open a hatch here, put in a different tool, and push the food out of that tunnel there. And so we introduced that to just a single chimpanzee here, using the stab technique, and here we introduced the alternative technique to a single chimpanzee here, and then we mix them with the rest of their group. And so what we're interested in is, once half that group have mastered it, however they're doing it, we move it here so they can watch through their window, then we move it here so they can do it, and once half of them have mastered it, we move it here so they can watch, then we move it here and test, well, what are these doing at the end of the story? And of course, similarly along here, what are they doing? So here are the first two models, color-coded. This is the stab technique, and this is the slide technique. So let's run the first group. And we find, well, already we've got a very significant difference. These do spread differentially in that first group. However, there's one chimpanzee works out you could do it the other way. So it's not totally out with chimpanzee's capacity. And in fact, that's the stab technique. For those who know chimps, give them a stick and give them a hole. Well, perhaps that's something rather closer to the surface in chimpanzees. And so we might predict, because of that, corruption, if you like, to the seeded technique, that if we run the whole experiment, by the time we get to the third group in each case, everybody will be doing the same thing. They'll all be just using the stab technique. But that's not what happened. If we run the whole sequence, to the contrary,
This group here are actually only doing what we seeded here, and which was the most common behavior all along, although there were these corruptions, which somehow the social learning process rode over, and that would be an inference perhaps of some kind of conformist tendency to do what most of them are doing, and so we end up with that third group doing the behavior that was seeded at the start. So if you just remember those data, and then I'll show them in a different way, same set of data, each block there is a chimpanzee, and I do that because then we did other experiments, in fact, with even more complicated devices, and I won't go into the details of that, but you can see from the blue and the green, we get the same kind of effect as we had with that previous task. And then we've done yet more. These ones done at the Yerkes Centre. Here are the results for the panpipes I described earlier, introducing poke. That whole group does poke. Introducing lift. Most of the group then do lift instead, although some work out you could do poke, perhaps again, closer to the surface in chimpanzees. So I won't go through all the details of that, but our conclusion here then was that we could show experimentally that chimpanzees would develop or would transmit multiple traditions in their community. And on that basis, we call them different cultures made up of multiple different traditions. So I think if we then incorporate that or relate that to our observations from the wild, then we conclude that we're on pretty firm ground in our inferences. And one could then add in such research as this, archaeological research. Christoph Bursch here at the Thai site, showing that at this site where chimpanzees crack nuts on the surface now, if you go down to a level which corresponds to over 4,000 years ago, you're finding archaeological evidence that's what they were doing then. And that rather kind of fits in with the experiment I've just described. But of course, here we're talking about many, many generations and a stable transmission. And then after that, or soon after our first chimpanzee study, Karel van Schaik and his group came up with similar findings for orangutans with something like 24 different traditions, and over time that's extended, so they've now logged what they think are over 30. And more recently, the gorilla researchers finally got their act together, did a collaborative study, and inferred that there were 22 different putative traditions they could identify. So, as Frans de Waal put it, cultural primatology comes of age. But then in the last 20 years, we've had research over a whole variety of species that have built up quite formidable database of evidence for social learning traditions and culture in a great variety of animals. And I want to quickly skate through some of these. I'm just going to pick out a few of what I regard as highlights. One thing that's happened is that studies of cetaceans, whales and dolphins, which were scarcely on our radar last century, have certainly become so. And so recently we've had a whole book about the evidence for culture in the lives of these creatures, and Hal Whitehead and Rendell concluding that culture, we believe, is a major part of what the whales are. So this isn't just some kind of icing on the cake of what whales are biologically, but fundamental to the kind of creatures they are and the lives that they lead, they conclude. And the evidence is built up. I think, it can cite 70 articles that have cultural transmission or social learning in their titles. And some of this research is on the transmission of these amazing songs of whales, which are incredibly complicated. I'm not an expert in them, but in my university there are several people who are, and they tell me that they're structured at 5 kind of hierarchical levels. So a whole song is made up of a number of themes, and we know that these are not genetic, that they must be socially transmitted, because they come up with new songs every few years, and then once a new song emerges, as it were, in a population, everybody starts singing that song. It spreads really quite quickly. And an extraordinary study led by Ellen Garland, who's now in our group at St Andrews. Oh, it's a bit distracting, isn't it? I'm competing with the whale. What she did was colour code each new song, which is a kind of, they describe as a revolutionary new song. It's really new. And they discovered that these tend to emerge off the coast of Australia, on the east of Australia, and then over the years they gradually drift across the ocean. So here's the blue-coded song occurring at these three places in 2002. A year later it spread a bit further, and by 2004 it's come right over to French Polynesia. Extraordinary, I think, research discovery. We don't really know why. Often when I ask for questions, people say, so why does it go that way? Nobody knows, I think. So there later is the maroon song, the red song, the yellow song, as you can see, doing the same kind of thing. Another behaviour which is important in the cultural lives of whales is migration. Many whales migrate halfway around the world or further. And what happens is that the calves follow their mother in the first migration. Sometimes they follow the return migration and even the next year. But even that one first migration with the mother lays down that pathway, it seems, for the rest of their lives, typically. So that's cetaceans, but you could draw a similar diagram for birds. There are quite a lot of birds that migrate halfway around the world or even further, and we find the same thing happening. That's to say, the young typically follow the parent on the first migration, and then that pathway seems to be adopted for the rest of their lives. And that's not true of all birds. If you think about cuckoos, they don't see their parents, and yet somehow they are migratory. They have something in their heads that tells them which way to go, and they start to migrate. So again, one would really like an experiment to sort of test that this kind of effect is the case, that the juveniles going with their parents, that is what actually teaches them the migratory path. And it just so happens that not so much because of trying to do this experimentally, but conservation efforts, we have that evidence, which comes from these amazing efforts in which geese, swans, cranes, and so on, these large birds are imprinted on microlight aircraft. So they treat the aircraft as their parent, and then they will follow the aircraft, and the aircraft can take them on a migratory pathway and lay down a new migratory pathway for birds who've lost that for some one or other reason. And so these are kind of surrogate parents demonstrating this kind of effect. And we see social learning and the development of traditions in various other aspects of behaviour as well. These are very nice experiments by Lucy Aplin with these little great tits, the same species that were taking the tops off the milk bottles, but now in a study in a wood near Oxford where they've got hundreds of these birds marked electronically so that when the bird comes to the artificial feeder like this, the computer knows, this is Lucy, who's arrived here, Lucy the great tit, and records what she does. And in each group that they studied, and there were several, they had some controls where nothing happened, but in some groups they introduced just two birds that they had trained either to push this little thing from the blue side to the right or from the pink side to the left. You might think, well, that's just a subtle difference. Is that really going to catch on? But it certainly did. And here's the graph showing the rise in the number of animals in the population. They adopted either the pink or the blue according to what had been seeded in their group. Control animals working it out for themselves later on, and then that starts to build up in those birds as well. But look at this graph. These are the two populations seeded with blue. Here are three seeded with red. A really strong effect, even going on from a first season to a second season. First season to a second season. And these guys actually just all doing the red behaviour that had been seeded in the previous season before. Remarkable effect. Okay, so now let's switch to mammals again, because this relatively recent study, I think, suggests that something may be going on which has been thought to be special to our species, and that's cumulative culture, as you already mentioned. So these bighorn sheep, in the natural state, they do what has sometimes been called green wave surfing. So in the spring, the grass starts to grow in the lowlands where they live. But then over time, it grows up higher and higher and up into the hills and mountains. And the animals migrate across that way. And are very skilled at finding just the next patch all the way up. But what happened in the populations that were studied here is that some of these animals had been exterminated from various regions of the USA, but then animals were translocated back into those areas. But when they did that, they stopped migrating. It was as if the animals looked around saying, well, I don't know what to do. And nothing happened originally. But then they tracked what did happen over time. And some of these animals were translocated up to 2 centuries ago. So they have a very long-term record here. And what they found was that gradually that migratory behavior returned in the new local environment. They started migrating a bit further. And then over the generations and decades, they migrated further and further. That's what the bottom graph shows here across the time. There's a couple of centuries here. The percent migratory went up like that. But they also had a measure of how skilled was their surfing knowledge, being able to, as it were, predict where's the next place to go and hitting it at the optimal time. And that skill also rose, which is what you're seeing in the top graph here. So their interpretation of all this, which is I guess, fairly controversial, I think they didn't realize when they were writing their conclusions, was that you have some cumulative process perhaps here. We know cumulative culture is very special to our species, and many argue that that's really what is distinct still in our species. It's only in our species you see cumulative culture, so that, over our lifetimes we've seen the cumulative cultural evolution of digital technology. So now we've got things like these and things like computers in our hands. But they're suggesting that perhaps, although this isn't anything like building the Eiffel Tower or creating an iPhone, it may be cumulative in that each generation inherits what the last one had learned, but then adds to it a bit, explores a bit further, becomes more skillful, and then that can be passed on to their calves, and so on in cycles of, as it were, exploration and social learning. And that kind of process might therefore be quite widespread. I think so. We might be at the beginning of an interesting exploration, I suspect. Okay. Here's one of those diffusion studies. I think I'll how are we doing for time? I brought my watch up, then I neglected to note when I really started. So I think I'll just skip that one and move on to a single slide for fish. It's important to mention fish. And here's a report from Kevin Leyland and Will Hoppett, where they described the research saying there's better evidence for culture in fish than in primates. And this was just at a time when Kevin was moving up to St Andrews from Cambridge to join our research group. And he didn't exactly endear himself to the primatologists in this little quotation. But of course, actually, they were right, because what you can do with these fish, and you can even do it in the wild on the reefs where they live, is capture a whole group and move a whole group to a different place. And those kind of experiments have been done in the wild and captivity, demonstrating that the kind of routes that these animals follow through their environments are socially transmitted and quite stable. In one study, they stayed the same, having been changed experimentally. They then stayed the same, followed the same routes for about 12 years following. Okay, so that's vertebrates. Now, I'm going to talk just quickly about 2 studies on insects to underline how widespread these capacities appear to be. This is an extraordinary study, I think, in which they took bumblebees and they trained one to pull this string, kind of scrabble at it, pull the string so that they would pull out this artificial flower here and get at the sweet material that was in the middle there. And then they allowed other bees to watch. So a bee has been trained in this way. That's the yellow bee in each of these hives. These 3 hives didn't have any such clever bee who knew how to do that. And as you can see, the behavior didn't appear in them. However, in the others, it did. All the bees marked in orange are the ones who got the behavior, having watched the original bee demonstrate it, as it were. But there are also some other bees. There's one down here marked in red, who didn't learn it from that first bee, but learned it from one of the other bees. So thinking in terms of a cultural transmission chain, we've got it going from A to B to C, and in fact there's a blue one there marked, which is D. So we've got like what you could describe as 4 cultural generations, quite remarkable here, and therefore they seem justified in having cultural transmission in their title. And then most recently, or more recently, we've got a study not in bees, but in these creatures with their tiny brains, Drosophila, fruit flies, the darling of the genetics laboratory. And the behavior looked at here is something we haven't mentioned yet, which is called mate choice copying. So in this little scenario here, which is actually a bit of kind of fruit fly pornography, really, you've got a male here who the experimenters dusted with green, mating with a female. This guy over here has been dusted red, and it's not his day. And these 2 females are watching what's going on. And what's been discovered is that you can take 2 females like that and then later give them the choice. Do you want to mate with a pink dusted or a green dusted male? And they'll want to mate, or there'll be a strong trend for them to decide to mate with the male that they've seen that all the other girls like. But what these authors did beyond that was to show that if you then take those females and make them the models mating with males that further females watch, you can have the same effect that we saw in the bumblebees. That's to say, there's transmission from one set to another, to another, to another, across 8 of these experimental transmissions. So, cultural flies, perhaps, right in that sense. So, I think that's my quick gallop through various bits of the animal kingdom, hopefully convincing you that something is happening here in terms of social learning traditions and culture being really quite widespread. And in the rest of the talk, I'm going to quickly go over 5 different aspects of what I'm calling the reach of animal culture, which we're starting to delineate and discover, I think. The first one I've already dealt with, the phylogenetic reach. The notion that these kind of phenomena are really quite widespread in nature, although, of course, they take quite different forms as well, which we're also delineating. But even if you look within a species, you may find that social learning can be pervasive in various ways. I wrote a review recently with Erica van der Waal called The Pervasive Role of Social Learning in Primate Lifetime Development. And here we're referring to, or we're distinguishing 3 different phases you can sometimes see in primates. The first 2 often grade into each other and vary by species. But in many primates, the young are spending a very long time with their mother because they're suckling. In the case of great apes, it's years. In the case of orangutans, that's their major companion for several years, really. And that's from her they learn most. But then, as time goes on, in the second phase, their social network starts to expand and they can learn from others. And this could be particularly important in species like gorillas, which are sexually dimorphic, so that adult males can have a somewhat different diet, for example, than adult females, and therefore a young male can only learn so much from his mother, and at some stage it may pay to apprentice to an adult male, or adult males watch what they're doing, and some of these kind of effects have been seen in great apes and in some other primates. There's a paper been published recently which covers these phases really, which is quite challenging by Caroline Schupley and Carol van Schaik, who study orangutans in the wild. And they're claiming we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. So despite the kind of claims I was talking about earlier on of dozens of different traditions, when we compare different chimpanzee or other great ape communities, they say we're still perhaps only seeing the tip of an iceberg. And part of that is that if you think about those procedures that we were using to compare different communities of great apes, we're trying to exclude things that can be explained by environmental or ecological differences. But of course, in the human case, an important aspect of culture is to adapt to your local ecology. If you're living in the far north, build igloos, wear big furry coats, and so on, which isn't appropriate in Brazil. So what they're saying is we really need to incorporate all that, because it could well be that animals are learning all that more basic stuff and behaviors that are adaptations to the local environment culturally. And their argument is that you can use this kind of behavior, which you also see in these slides of chimpanzees here, which they're calling peering. And it's this very close attention you see certainly in great apes, but I suspect you also find it in animals like your capuchins. Very close attention to what adults are doing. And they tried to validate that as a measure of social learning to show that it wasn't, for example, easily explicable as just an interest in scrounging from others, by showing effects such as that what an animal has watched, it might be use of a particular tool or nest building, that's what the animal focuses on in its activity for the next hour. And there's a particular focus on more complex and challenging behaviors, which then fades as the animal develops their own competence. So a number of analyses they did of that kind. And then what they've done is to record all the different aspects of behavior that the young orangutans peer at, and that gives them much greater numbers of putative cultural acquisitions. In the case of one of their communities of orangutans, over 190. So that's why they're saying we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. And this is their picture of the iceberg. They're saying really what we've picked out so far is this rather often high, complex and visible kind of variation you see between communities, but what about all the more basic day-to-day activities, which of course in the human case is also an important aspect of culture. So they describe this as an iceberg. I did a dispatch for Current Biology on this, and I got the artist to, so can't you produce as an iceberg? So here's the iceberg with their inference. This is what we've learned about so far, but there's a lot of behavior they're arguing, which is adapted to local ecology, you really need to be focusing on there as well. And even behaviors that are universal, but still could be culturally acquired. I mean, you think of the human case, you probably, use of knives, use of cups, increasingly use of mobile phones, it's probably found around the world, but that's not to say it's not culturally acquired. So, but this is very controversial, and some of us can argue about it later, perhaps. Phase three is when animals disperse, and typically one sex or the other does disperse at maturity, sometimes both, which avoids inbreeding. And what's happening there, of course, is you're entering a different habitat, a different community. And we got some insight into this, I think, by this experiment we did a few years ago, in which we were interested initially in the question of, well, is social learning really important in what infants learn? Or do they just individually explore and discover what to eat? These animals, these vervet monkeys in South Africa, were fed a box of corn once a month to see who's high-ranking, who's low-ranking. And what we did was divide it into two, dye half of it pink, half of it blue in this box here, and we made one taste so horrible that after 3 exposures, 2 groups just ate blue and ignored the pink, and 2 groups ate pink and ignored the blue. Then what we did several months later, when a crop of infants had matured and started eating solid food, which they didn't at the training phase, we took the nasty stuff out of the pink and blue food, just presented pink and blue, both perfectly edible and palatable, to see, well, do the infants try each of them and work out which ones they want to eat, or are they influenced by what the rest of the group is doing? And the answer was very much the latter. That's to say, 26 of 27 infants all ate what the group ate. The one who didn't really underlined the point, because that was a low-ranking mother who could only go in and snatch some of the less preferred food, which of course now tasted fine, but that's what her infant fed. So it was 27 infants out of 27 who preferred what their mother ate. But then we move on to the dispersion phase, when this is pure luck. Is the kind of thing that happens if you're doing an experiment like this for one reason. Be alert, because the other thing that just happens may be scientifically the much more interesting thing. And we were very fortunate that 10 males migrated such as for these three here, they've been in a group where they're just eating blue, everyone eats blue, everyone ignores pink. They move into a different group, and lo and behold, they're finding everybody's eating pink and nobody's eating blue. I mean, what would you do? Think, what would you do, or what would you predict these males would do? And what they did was switch immediately to the locally preferred diet, at least particularly when there was no one they had to compete with. And of course, there may be more than one reason why they would do that. Many biologists would think, well, they're perhaps doing that because they've moved to a different habitat. They don't perhaps quite know what's the best thing to eat there. And so to do what the locals do, follow what the local preferences are, would be adaptive. We have this expression in Europe, I don't know if it's common here, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And it would seem that that's the kind of rule that they're following. But there could be other reasons, such as social reasons, to ingratiate yourself with others, particularly the females they're wanting to be mating with, if they're lucky. So just to be, I'm like you. I eat the same stuff as you, perhaps. We don't know the function. But the point of this is that when animals do move to different regions, then you get a kind of third phase of social learning, because there's a new habitat, there are new things to learn about there, and a good way to learn about them is what the locals know. But also you've got to learn about the dynamics of your new group, which you can often learn by observation, and who, for example, acts in certain ways to others. So this notion of all-pervading culture, I think, is underlined by that quotation I gave from Whitehead and Rendell before. And if you list all the different contexts in which we've now got evidence, observational or often experimental evidence for social learning, well, it's pretty much the whole gamut of behaviours that one can think of that we see in animals. So that's pervasiveness within species. The third reach I want to emphasize is the implications for evolutionary biology at large. And Edu already alluded to some of these. I've called this social learning process the second inheritance system, primary inheritance system obviously being genetics. But once you've got this secondary inheritance system, there's the potential for secondary forms of evolution through Darwinian processes. And I don't need to say too much about that because I think Ed, you explained it very well. I've written about it, for example, in papers in these collections here. And I've done a recent review, which is called Cultural Evolution in Animals. And I'll just extract one illustration from this, which is based on this paper here by Heather Williams and colleagues, Back to Birdsong here. And they studied changes, what they described as evolutionary cultural changes in the song over 30 years. So here's an example at the top of the song in 1982. And in many ways, of course, it's similar and recognizable at 2012, but has various interesting details. And what these authors suggested is there might be three different kinds of evolutionary process going on here. One is mutations, so over the generations there are errors in copying, or at least copying isn't perfect. And so one can just get a process of drift in what the song sounds like, without any selection for it to go in any particular direction. And that would correspond to many kinds of evidence for drift in biological evolution or genetically driven evolution. So drift's a well-known phenomenon. But then over here are two selective processes they're suggesting. In one, stabilizing selection, there are some aspects of the song that stay more stable over this 30-year period than one would predict from the processes of mutation and drift. So perhaps there are processes there holding it stable, and those may be the things saying, I'm a savanna sparrow song. Whereas they're suggesting that these processes produce differences, or there are differences amongst birds, which may be just saying, I'm Fred, or I'm Lucy. But then there's a third kind of selection, which is perhaps you might say, the core of Darwinian notions, directional selection. And we know perhaps one of the best examples of that in birdsong is that birds who live in urban areas, over time, the frequency of their song has gone up and up and up, so they can be heard beyond the hubbub of the traffic we have in environments like this. And what these authors found was that there were various aspects of this song that, if males sung them, were associated with greater reproductive success. And over the 30 years, there was a change in that direction. So there seems to be possibly sexually selected, or perhaps ecologically, as in the traffic noise case, a form of directional selection. So we're early days in exploring these kind of phenomena. And then the other kind of impact for evolutionary biology has to do with gene culture co-evolution, which again Edu's already mentioned, and I think he offered the example of lactose intolerance. So cultures that are dairy farmers, they're marked in green here, tolerant to lactose, and the blue ones are not. Well, there's increasing evidence for these kind of effects in animals as well. Hal Whitehead, the expert on cetacean behavior, has been a leader in this field and wrote this paper, this review. So I don't have time to go into that, but that exists there. And then more recently, he's joined forces with some of the others of us in this field to write a review which is about gene culture co-evolution in animals. A certain amount of this is surely speculative and perhaps going beyond the information given, but there's a lot of evidence pointing to this now. The fourth thing I've got listed here might be regarded as a particular case of implications for evolutionary biology, implications for human evolution, and I think probably the main point I just want to make here is all this research on animal culture suggests that, well, human culture isn't completely unique, or at least it didn't just come out of the blue. It probably likely had foundations, which we can perhaps best infer from comparisons with great apes. And I'll put up a horrible slide in a moment. But the principle is that if you want to infer what the common ancestor of the great apes was like, well, it's not that difficult. You look at all the characteristics that the apes share and reconstruct an ancestor that showed those fundamental characteristics. We pretty much know what our great ape ancestor must have looked like. But can we do the same for culture? Well, we can, by the kind of analysis I've been looking at. This is the horrible slide, which I'm not going to go through in any detail, and which you can't probably even read. But in this column here, I've listed what I've inferred to be some of the shared features, some to do with population-level patterning, like those traditions across Africa for chimpanzees, various aspects of the social learning processes, and even the cultural content, such as nut cracking, which it shares many characteristics, as well as other tool use with the earliest evidence we have for human tool use, as in percussive technologies. And there may be cultural anthropologists here, I don't know, who may be skeptical about some of the claims we're making for animal culture. I just want to put this cover of this book up by Peter Jordan, who is a cultural anthropologist, and I was delighted when, in his introductory chapter, he adopted this whole kind of scheme here as the structure for the book, and has related all his evidence on cultural transmission among hunter-gatherers to this kind of scheme. Nice bit of interdisciplinary interaction, I think. Okay, the final thing I wanted to say about the reach of animal culture is realizing its implications for conservation of animals. I was delighted in 2018 when the United Nations, I've got a letter from the United Nations Environment Programme, saying, well, we've been reading some of this evidence about the pervasiveness of animal culture. We think it probably really matters for conservation. And they brought together a workshop in Parma in Italy. Here are all the participants in that, to try and set out all the multiple potential implications of animal culture for conservation. We produced a 30-page report, and then last year, a little kind of 3-page summary to get our messages out to the world at large in science. And there's a poster, you've got a poster session going. I brought a poster about that, you'll see if you just go out the door. And later that month, there was a paper by coincidence about human impact eroding chimpanzee behavioral diversity, which we now infer is largely based on culture. But human impacts like logging and so on having a severe impact on that and reducing the diversity of culture. So both of these papers coming to proposals such as, I suppose the most radical one is to shift from the notion of conservation being to conserve genomes, to conserve species. What perhaps some cultures ought to be the focus for what we're trying to conserve. And in fact, it just so happens, again, by coincidence, there's a meeting of the Scientific Council corresponds to all these efforts in Bonn today, at which there's a copy of that same poster up, because there's a proposal being discussed there that the culture of chimpanzees in West Africa, which is nutcracking and isn't seen elsewhere in Africa, could be such a focus. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the conservation community thinks to that kind of notion. But that's me done. I'll put that summary up there. Of course, before I got to this, these 5 aspects of the reach of animal culture, I was trying to give you a quick run through the animal kingdom to support the conclusion that culture in some ways, social learning, traditions, culture, in some ways is really very widespread and has important impacts which we're starting to chart. So that's the discovery of animal culture. As ever, put up a slide, thanking all the people I've collaborated with over the years. So this is a sort of gradually increasing set, and all the people who funded us, I suppose, over the last quarter century of research on this. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And now we have some time for questions. The microphone is circulating.
Hi, good morning, Professor. I'd like to thank you for your talk. We are pleased to receive you here. I am Briseida Rezende. I'm a professor at Psychology Institute. We met on Monday. I'd like to ask, I don't know if you talked something about that and I didn't get it from your talk, so it would be an opportunity to discuss it. Not so fast. I mean, I'm sorry about my vocabulary in English is I have to switch a key and I'm thinking in Portuguese. We are talking about animal culture, and I believe you are thinking about a phenomenon where we have social learning and the transmission throughout generations and the spread throughout populations. And in this sense, what is the difference between animal culture and traditions, and why should we use the word culture if it may cause some noise when we talk to people from social science and things like that? That would be a first question, and then I have another question. You were talking about conservation, which is a very, very important issue, especially these days, and in the whole world, and here in Brazil, we have serious troubles about it. And thus, I'd like to know how are you listening to indigenous people and this local learning, because these are the people who are really who really knows how to do that. Where they can. It's conservated. I mean, so I think the question would be, what are the political consequences of all these studies, and do you have some political arm that is working with indigenous people, and in this sense. Thank you.
Okay, so the first question I think was about, in the first case, what do we mean by traditions and culture, and how we're defining those, and is it justified to use those terms? I would say in the broad field of animal culture and cultural evolution generally, what's not controversial is to talk about social learning. So that's basic, just learning from others. And there are some more technical definitions, which importantly underline that sometimes you can learn from not just from watching the behavior of others, but from some of their consequences or even the things they leave behind, such as the tools that have been used. But that's not particularly controversial. And then traditions also, I think there's a fairly good consensus on what we mean by traditions, and minimal definitions would be that, in fact, there is a minimal definition due to Dorothy Frigesi and Elisabetta Wieselbergi, who've worked on the local Capuchins, which refers to, I think, at least two individuals picking something, learning something through social learning, so perhaps just the second learning from the first, and it having some duration, but that's unspecified. So even that definition, although people may accept that as a sort of minimal definition of tradition, in fact, sometimes when I say that, I think, well, I've got a friend, we agreed to have lunch on the last Friday of each month. And we've been doing that several times now. So we're starting to say, well, we're building a bit of a tradition, aren't we? There's only two of us, and we've only been doing it for a few months. However, if we do this for years, and if some of our friends join us or some of our family, then it expands and expands. And, in principle, perhaps it could even go to another generation. So that I think the sort of notion of what a tradition is in its inherently fuzzy, because you can perhaps agree to that minimal definition. We've got the beginning of a tradition, you might say, I suppose, which may develop into something bigger if it goes beyond generations, if it goes to larger and larger communities, or even a country. However, even with those disagreements, that there's agreement about using the term tradition. Culture has long been more controversial, I guess, because we regard ourselves as so special in our culture. And various writers, even animal behavior, have questioned that. I think perhaps one of the best known is Bennett Galef, Jeff Galef, as he's known, who's one of the major figures in animal social learning research, argued that perhaps we shouldn't just immediately use the term culture when we're talking about these phenomena in animals. Let's just talk about traditions. But if we have evidence for transmission processes which start to approximate the ones that he would argue are special in humans, such as high fidelity imitation or teaching, then we might talk about culture. But different authors have come up with different ideas about that. And Edu put up a mention that Carol van Schaik and I, in one paper, suggested, largely on the basis of the great apes studies that I've been talking about, one useful notion of drawing distinction between tradition and culture is that cultures could be arrays of traditions, which I think is often the way we think about culture in the human case. If we talk about what's the difference between, say, culture in Brazil and in Scotland, where I come from, well, we start to talk about communication, the kind of foods we eat, the cuisine, and so on and so forth. And so we're saying, well, so for animals. But I think the bottom line here, I would argue, is that there's no such thing as a correct definition of anything. And a lot of these studies, you first of all need a definition of what you're going to mean by social learning or tradition and culture. Then you can do empirical research which shows whether what we see in the world corresponds with what we've agreed is a definition. So that second empirical step is the real scientific one, you might say. The first step of just the definitions, we can't empirically show that, that's a correct definition for culture. What we can aim to do is at least know what the others are talking about when they use these terms. And so in our papers, I think it's always it's always important to define them explicitly. So that would be kind of answer. We can maybe talk about it later. But so then you had a second question about conservation, which is difficult for me to answer because I'm not an expert in conservation. I didn't come to this as an expert in conservation. I was a bit surprised when I was invited to this Palmer workshop, and I guess it's because I could talk about all the stuff I've talked about this morning. So I was involved, and I'm quite keen to see how far it can go. But I'm not an expert in conservation who knows how to handle the kind of problems you're alluding to. That, for example, many conservation measures might impact negatively on indigenous people in the area. So we want to preserve this forest and not log it, and they're saying, but that's our livelihood. I was just in Madagascar a few weeks ago, and they're concerned with the conservation of lemurs, and there's vast logging going on. And they've got a program there where when they are replanting in an area which has been destroyed and burned, ready for farming, they're persuading the local people, plant trees, and then around the trees plant herbs which have an intrinsic value, and spices, and doing the economics to show that will give you twice the return if you plant rice, which is what would have happened. So I think efforts like that that make sense for indigenous people are what's needed. But that takes us into sort of expertise beyond the kind of material I've talked about. There's other aspects of the implications of culture for conservation, I think, such as where there are reintroductions, which does happen, but can often be tricky. It's being realized that it's very important that the animals are, as it were, culturally knowledgeable as they need to be. Otherwise, the results are disastrous, and there's massive mortality because individuals are introduced without the cultural knowledge that the wild animals would have.
Good morning, Nicolas Chalin from the USP as well. I work with ants. I was really interested by your last examples that you showed that suggest that actually culture goes against innovation. And most examples you show is actually that conservationism is common in social species. So my question would be, when would conservationism be selected, and how would you go about to study the conditions where it would be actually selected that new things would spread in the culture?
Yeah, I think it's an important, sort of criticism almost of the sort of major push in this line of research, including what I've been doing, which has been to focus on the social learning side of culture. Because even setting aside cumulative culture, for culture of any of the kinds of, say, the chimpanzee behaviors I was referring to, some individuals must have invented it at some stage. There must have been a first chimpanzee who cracked a nut. Obviously, that wasn't cultural dependent, unless they learned it from watching humans. But that's another question. But I think it's because the major questions have been, do animals have these capacities to socially transmit and sustain traditions and culture, that we've done these experiments where we really do the innovation. So that panpipes experiment, we invented you could do it this way, or we invented you could do it that way, and we haven't really been focusing on the innovation aspect. I mean, there are studies of innovation. There's a whole book on innovation edited by Simon Reeder and Kevin Leyland. But really tying that together with culture, I think is still quite a significant challenge for the future, and requires often a different approach. Because in the wild, you can see occasionally, you're lucky, and see an innovation and recognize it. And the slide I whizzed past about lobtail feeding in Wales, in humpback whales, is a case in point. So that was where the whales started smacking the surface of the water with their tail. Are they the flukes? And that makes the prey beneath bunch together, and so they can gulp it up better. And that was observed just in a couple of whales, but then it spread over the years. And in fact, the professional scientists, helped often by many amateurs going out and doing observations out at sea, eventually recorded it spread over, I think it was 27 years in that report in Science there, and over 600 whales. And the way in which it spread corresponds to the social relationships between the whales. So that was a nice demonstration of this, as it's been called, network-based diffusion analysis, where you can record the innovation by luck, and then you can track its diffusion. And that's also been done for an aspect of chimpanzee behavior, a modification of using vegetation as a sponge to get water out of trees, and a modification of that occurred, and then that spread in that way as well. Okay. No, I would say that those links are important in the spread of the tradition. But the interesting question, I suppose, is why does the innovation come about, and what individuals do that? Another interesting case for thinking about this, I guess, is the whales I was talking about earlier on, talking about songs of whales and those revolutions that happen on the coast of Australia and then drift across the Pacific. Recent studies by Jenny Allen, working with Ellen Garland, have shown that actually over the period in which it spreads, it gradually becomes the songs become more complex. And that, who knows what's going on there? There may be some sexual selection going on there. To be a really sexy male, you have to sing a song a bit more complicated than last year's. They get more complex until they reach a point where they crash. And then that's when you get the revolutionary new song. And the revolutionary new song is simpler. I mean, it's an innovation, but it's simpler than what happened by this process of perhaps cultural evolution. And that's some of the latest research in this area. I think is really exciting.
Thank you for your amazing talk. I'm a lecturer at the Biosciences Institute, but working with archaeology, so interested in cultural evolution and evolutionary archaeology. And as you were mentioning conservation, I was thinking about conservation from the point of view of an archaeologist, which means the preservation of heritage and archaeological sites. Also because now we know that sites are not exclusive to humans. We have chimpanzee archaeological sites, and how these places are actually the only long-term record that we have in terms of cultural transmission. And I don't know if you have any ideas about it. And I also have a very straightforward question that is really out of ignorance, but
can I just deal with that first one before
Sure,
I forget?
sure. Okay.
I mean, it's something I've not thought about before. But you're right. I mean, for the chimpanzees and for the capuchins, we know. I talked about the 4,000-year record. I'm sure probably every local person knows that for your capuchins, you have somewhat similar periods, certainly 3,000 years, and for all we know, it may be tens of thousands. And so that material is there and merits conservation. I guess the conservation bodies, like the International Union for Conservation of Nature and so on, they really are thinking about species and conserving the animals. That's not on their radar. But if they start to think about culture, like they may be doing in Bonn right now, it's going to be interesting to hear. Maybe that would be something to tack on to that. I don't know. It's almost a question of thinking, well, kind of which institution ought to be taking responsibility for something like that, because I guess there are institutions that take care of human archaeological conservation, obviously. But then they're different from, the World Wildlife Fund and all these organizations who are working on conservations on the animal. So this is some kind of intermediate material that we're talking about, and question of who should have responsibility for it. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. But you had another question. Are we still going on questions? I know at some stage you're going to want to say.
Well, I could sum of the coffee break in time to allow her to finish her question, please.
Okay, it's a very quick one. Is there any other evidence of the coevolution of gene and culture other than the ones that you show? Is it something that is in the research agenda of nowadays, or?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the kind of phenomena that are talked about here include anatomical. So, killer whales, for example, are thought to have several different cultures. They're referred to as ecotypes. But some killer whales hunt seals, and others hunt fish, for example. Those are quite specialized ecological adaptations. And in fact, if you're from a culture that does seals, it may be quite difficult, or perhaps even the other way around, if you're one that concentrates on fish, quite difficult to move to a culture who has a very different hunting skill and mate there and so on. So there are implications of that. But it's been found there are some anatomical specializations which the cetacean researchers infer have followed the cultures. So the ones who feed on seals have got stronger jaws. So of course it's difficult to know what's cause and what's effect, and perhaps the most plausible explanation is some culture gene co-evolution. Excuse me, that the things evolved in concert. A more radical form of this would be something I think you already mentioned, the cultural intelligence hypothesis, which is that those species who become more cultural, there's selection pressure on them to become more cognitively sophisticated, perhaps in order to acquire the culture, store it in their brains, and become skilled at some of the things that involved, like tool use. But then we have to contrast, that cultural intelligence hypothesis predicting that if you're very cultural, you're going to have big brains. Remember the fruit flies and the bees and the fish, who have some aspects of culture we're in.
Thank you, Andy, for the talk, and we don't have time for more questions, but you can all use the coffee breaks and all the intermissions to go on with these conversations with the speakers. But now I suggest like a 10-minute break instead of 15 minutes, so we can recover our timing, and then please be back at 11 for the next talk.
Okay. Can I just add one little thing? I brought a list of our recent publications, and there's copies of them over on that desk there for anyone who's that keen.
Welcome back. Just a little announcement for you who are checking our original schedule. We have a small change in the sequence of speakers because Dr. Christine Leguer had her flight delayed, so she will speak after lunch, 2 p.m. So now we've been talking about potential differences between human and non-human cultures, particularly the extremely cumulative nature of human culture. So to talk about impressive experiments on this subject, I'll have the pleasure to introduce you now Dr. Christine Caldwell. So please.
Okay, thanks, Edu, and thanks everyone for coming to this workshop. It's a real honour to have been invited to participate in this workshop and to sort of contribute a piece of the story of the field of cultural evolution. Okay, I think we're good to go. So yeah, as I said, I'm going to be talking about this aspect of human cumulative culture, which we think may be something a bit different about human culture from what we see in non-humans, which Andy's just given you a really excellent introduction to. So first of all, I want to start talking about this question of the distinctiveness of human cumulative culture, what it is that seems to be different and why it's a particularly interesting form of cultural evolution. Moving on to talking about how we can start to investigate the question of the mechanisms that may underpin this phenomenon of cumulative culture. Specifically, I'll talk about research that myself and my research group have been carrying out over the past sort of decade or so, using laboratory approaches with human participants to study cultural evolution in the lab, so that we can study it experimentally to start asking these questions about what are the mechanisms involved. Then want to move on to the question of the potential for cumulative culture in non-humans. So Andy's already alluded to the fact that we do seem to see some semblance of cumulative culture in non-humans. So another question that my group are really interested in at the moment are to what extent do we see cumulative culture in non-humans, and what seems to be limiting that? So why does it seem, if it is present, why does it seem not quite as pervasive as what we see in humans? So I'll talk about some of the experimental demonstrations of cumulative culture in animals. So this idea that we perhaps can see cumulative culture, at least in principle, in some species. And then go on to talk about how we can go about investigating things like the limits on the potential for cumulative culture in populations like non-human animals, and also young children as well. So what's actually limiting what they can do compared with adult humans, for example. At this point in the talk, I'll probably have to move on to being a bit more vague about study details. So my research group are working on these questions at the moment, but the studies that we've done are actually not published yet. So I don't want to say too much about them at the moment, because this is work carried out by my PhD students that obviously they'll be looking to publish in due course. But hopefully I can give you a little taster of the kind of things that we're doing, and fingers crossed there should be some papers coming out on those topics within the next year or two. So finally, I'll finish up by saying a little bit about what we think now may perhaps explain the breadth of scope of human cumulative culture and the direction that some of these studies have taken us in. So to start with this question of the distinctiveness of human cumulative culture, really this is a phenomenon that has attracted a lot of interest within the field of cultural evolution, and I think for good reason. Obviously, there's a lot of things as humans that kind of set us apart from other species. A lot of those traits do seem to be culturally transmitted ones. So, for example, our use of technology, our use of complex symbolic communication systems, these all seem to be culturally transmitted traits. And there's all sorts of other things as well that set us apart from other species that seem to be largely dependent on culture. So really, if we are interested in questions of human uniqueness, human distinctiveness, then understanding human cultural evolution and the peculiarities of human cultural evolution are really key to understanding kind of almost all of those other things. So that's one of the reasons I'm particularly interested in this topic. And really, the kind of focus of the research that's going on within my group at the moment can more or less be boiled down to this one central question, which is whether differences in the kinds of cultural evolutionary processes that we observe in humans compared with other species, whether these can be explained in terms of the cognitive mechanisms involved. So is it possible to identify cognitive mechanisms that explain why human cultural evolution seems to be so different? Now, obviously, a first step towards doing that, to answering that question, is being reasonably clear about what we're talking about in terms of these differences. So really, to discuss that question, when we're talking about cumulative culture and what seems to be different about human cumulative culture compared with the cultural evolution that we see in lots of other species, there's some kind of disagreement over the details. So there's some debate over the fine detail of how we should be defining cumulative culture. So there's not perfect agreement over how to define it, but broadly speaking, there's general agreement over kind of certain factors. So for starters, there's general agreement that in human cultural evolution, we see characteristic patterns of consistent directional change over multiple generations of transmission. And again, this is something that Andy talked about, highlighting in some of the studies of birdsong, for example. That's a particularly interesting feature that we see in some cases evidence of directional change as well as drift-like change. But in human cultures, this seems to be quite common, and certainly it's a feature that we would normally assume was an element of cumulative culture, that there would be consistent directional change. And specifically, that direction of change represents increasing benefits of some sort. So what we're looking at in terms of later traits are ones that offer benefits over and above their sort of cultural predecessors, the traits that they've evolved from. So some improvement in utility, increases in functionality or efficiency, for example. And when we see that kind of cultural evolution, we usually refer to that as cumulative cultural evolution or just cumulative culture. And as I said, there's general agreement on this. So a paper came out last year, in fact, by Alex Massoudi and Alex Thornton, where they actually attempted to sort of define key characteristics of cumulative culture, and their definition was largely consistent with what I've just said. So they talked about a change in behaviour, typically due to asocial learning. That's how the change is occurring, and that behaviour then being transmitted via social learning in that novel or modified form, and the learned behaviour obviously causing some kind of improvement in performance, and that happening as an iterative process, so that happening repeated over multiple generations. So this idea of kind of increasing benefits over multiple generations in a kind of directional fashion is pretty key to cumulative culture. And there's lots of examples from human behaviour that show hallmarks of this kind of process, and lots of behaviours which are actually quite fundamental to kind of human survival, really, and in lots of the habitats that we inhabit. So, for example, complex food preparation techniques or garment construction techniques, or complex hunting skills and the tools used to engage in hunting. So these behaviours exhibit hallmarks of cumulative culture, not just because they're complex, but also because they seem to be extremely useful. And they seem to be the kinds of behaviours that would be very difficult to invent for a single individual. We suspect they've been built up over many generations to their current complex, highly adapted form. And in fact, for some behaviours, we can even see evidence of this kind of gradual incremental progress. So, for example, this is an image that gets showed a lot in illustrating the process of cumulative cultural evolution. So this shows a sequence of hammer tools over history, the hammers becoming kind of increasingly sophisticated in design and increasingly well designed for a highly specific purpose of hammering. So really, what I want to kind of try and convey to you is that cumulative cultural evolution really for humans is an extremely neat trick. It seems to be a very useful thing to be able to do. So it seems to provide an extremely powerful source of adaptive traits, which as far as we know seems to be unparalleled in other species. And the reason it does that is because it seems to allow us to benefit from others' accumulated exploration benefits in the absence of direct personal experience of our own. So we don't have to go through that lengthy process of trial and error, trying things out, working out possibilities. We can actually just adopt the behaviours that are common within a group and kind of get a massive head start to our learning that way. So it really is an extremely useful trick. And as I've mentioned there, it seems to be, as far as we know, largely unparalleled in other species. And once again, there's not a huge amount of disagreement over this, although there are now some sort of putative examples of what looks to be cumulative culture in some non-human species, and I'll talk about those a bit more later. broadly speaking, it seems to be something that's quite rare in non-human behaviour. So even those that we think about as being some of the strongest advocates of the abilities of non-humans, for example, are agreed on this point. So this is a quote by Jane Goodall, which I think is a really nice illustration of that point. She says, "Undoubtedly, given the investigative and manipulative tendencies of the young chimpanzee and his ability to learn through trial and error, almost all of the feeding and tool-using behaviours I have described could be invented anew by each individual." So what she's saying is chimpanzees are obviously very smart. They do engage in all of these sorts of complex behaviours that involve a lot of learning. Some of these behaviours may even be socially learned, but nonetheless, they're the kinds of behaviours that individuals can, in principle, invent for themselves. And that seems to be quite different from a lot of what we see in human cultures. So, for example, though we do, of course, see hammering in chimpanzees and also, of course, capuchin monkeys, as Eddie was telling you earlier, this seems to stay in more or less a similar form over many generations, and as far as we know, doesn't change a great deal over time. The caveat there is that obviously the evidence is lacking, and it would be really, really interesting to know a lot more about the history of these traits. But as far as we can tell, there doesn't seem to be the same pace of change in these behaviours in non-humans that we see in humans. So there's a question that seems to need answering. Humans have this really neat trick that gives us all sorts of adaptive behaviours, and we don't seem to see it to the same extent in other species. So one of the things that I was particularly interested in finding out when I first got interested in this topic was the question of what are the mechanisms underpinning human cumulative culture? Is there something that we are able to do that is allowing us to engage in cumulative culture in ways that we don't see in non-humans? And how we went about doing that was by trying to study cultural evolution under laboratory conditions so we could use it to actually run experiments and test out some hypotheses about mechanisms that may or may not be necessary to this process. So essentially what we wanted to do in taking this experimental approach was, first of all, find some means of capturing the process. If we were going to do this in the lab, then we needed to find a way that we could create a kind of simple laboratory model system that we could then play with experimentally. So the first step was capturing the process, and then the next step was going to be manipulating the mechanisms that could be employed to see if we saw any changes in the process that occurred. So in adopting this first step of capturing the process, one of the things that I was really eager to capture was the idea that actually within a given generation, you might have kind of quite equally matched opportunities for learning to previous generations, but that it was really just the information that you were exposed to that was allowing later generations to perform better. And I think that was captured really nicely in some of the theoretical literature that was around at the time. So, for example, research by Boyd and Richardson had already alluded to this property of human cumulative culture as being something quite distinctive and something that made social learning and social information use particularly adaptive. And they talked about this idea of cultural transmission allowing learned improvements to accumulate from one generation to the next. So the idea that over generations, behaviours might become increasingly well adapted to the environment, and later generations would actually get benefits that earlier ones hadn't as a result of this accumulated exploration effort. And so what they described in trying to capture that in their theoretical model that they created was that for a given amount of time and effort, the better an individual's initial guess, the better on average its final performance. So the idea was that imitators, social learners, those that were able to get some benefit from the behaviours exhibited by those around them, those would start their search closer to the sort of optimal behaviour. They'd get a head start to their learning, and so it would take less search effort for them to reach a sort of highly adaptive optimal behaviour. So that's really what we were trying to capture in our laboratory models. So what we wanted to capture pretty much was this idea, the idea that over generations of learners, you'd actually get kind of increasing success. So within a generation, you'd have sort of similar opportunities for learning in terms of the amount of time and effort that could be devoted to it. But nonetheless, if you learned from somebody else, that would give you a bit of an advantage. And if you learned from somebody else who'd already themselves done a bit of learning from a previous individual, that might give you even more of an advantage. And in that way, the benefits would accumulate. That's what we really wanted to capture. The reason that I've illustrated this along with the graph with these structures that look like they're made out of spaghetti is because this is one of the tasks that we actually used to answer this question initially. Edgy's already shown an image of some of our spaghetti towers because this was a method that we used in some of the first experiments that I ever carried out on this topic. So the task was essentially for a participant simply to build a tower from raw spaghetti and modelling clay, which is actually harder than it sounds. And the goal was to build these towers to be as tall as possible. So our hypothesis essentially was that that participants in later generations who have the benefit of being able to learn from earlier ones should be able to build taller towers. They should be able to copy good designs and learn what to do and learn what not to do from observing others, in spite of otherwise similar learning opportunities. So yeah, this is just some images illustrating participants taking part in this particular task, so building these towers from spaghetti and modelling clay. The other task that we gave participants to complete, because we wanted to show that this process was something quite general and that it would apply to multiple task contexts, we also used another task which involved asking participants this time to build paper airplanes. So we just gave them a single sheet of paper, asked them to build a paper airplane, this time the goal measure being flight distance. So the goal was to build this paper airplane to fly as far as possible. Once again, the hypothesis being that the planes built in later generations should actually have greater flight distances than the ones from earlier generations, because those participants would have the benefit of that accumulated social information. At this point, I think it's important to draw attention to the contribution of my research assistant on that project, Dr. Ailsa Millen. So Ailsa was the first research assistant who was employed on the first grant that I had funded on this topic. So it was Ailsa who ran all of these early experiments with the paper airplanes and spaghetti towers, and as a result, she's my co-author on all of my early publications on this topic. So what we did in setting up these laboratory models of cultural evolution was we created what we termed, following other literature, micro-societies of participants. So groups of participants composed of 10 generations of learners. So each group was composed of 10 participants, all of whom took part in the task kind of in sequence. So they took part one after the other with staggered start times. So each individual participant was given 5 minutes of observation time, followed by 5 minutes of building time with which to create their paper airplane or their spaghetti tower. And every 2.5 minutes, we were removing the most experienced member of the group and replacing them with a new naive individual who entered the test group. So what that meant was that at any given time, actually in the test group, actively involved in the task, apart from at the very start and very end of these chains, there was 4 individuals, 2 of whom were engaged in the actual construction of their artifact, and 2 of whom were simply observing. And so we were doing this, removing and replacing every 2.5 minutes. The idea being that simulated generational succession. So we had complete population turnover, if you like, by the end of the chain. So the participants that were involved in the test groups at the end of the chain had essentially not encountered the participants at the very start of the chain. So they hadn't seen the very early artifacts that were produced, only the ones that they were exposed to. So in that respect, we wanted to keep things balanced over these conditions, so not only making sure that participants had the same amount of time to sort of engage in the task, but also so they have the same sort of the same amount of social learning opportunities, so the same amount of exposure time, the same number of models that they were exposed to, so that we kept that balanced as well, so that we knew it really was a function of being exposed to, if you like, better social information, if we were finding that they performed better. And sure enough, that was what we found. So we were expecting that these participants in later generations would be able to perform better in terms of these goal measures. For the paper airplanes, that was what we found. So the participants in later generations were building planes that flew further than the participants in earlier generations. And for the spaghetti towers, similar sort of results. So the participants in later generations were building towers that were taller than those built by participants in earlier generations. So with that sort of goal kind of achieved, we felt like we'd captured our model of the process of cultural evolution in the lab. We managed to capture this phenomenon of later generations being able to kind of perform better as a result of the accumulated information. Having captured that process, the next step was obviously to start manipulating the mechanisms, to run experiments in order to investigate, okay, under what circumstances is this process facilitated, under what circumstances is the process inhibited, and what can that tell us about what's necessary for our participants to engage in cumulative culture. So in the follow-up study, we wanted to particularly investigate the question of whether imitation really was necessary, because this was kind of the dominant idea at the time, that humans might engage in cumulative culture because we had capacities for imitation that weren't matched in other species. And we can see this idea captured quite nicely, and also what was meant by imitation, because I think that's quite important in these quotes here. So the top one is a quote from Claudio Tenier, who studies chimpanzees, and what he says is, human cultural traditions can and do accumulate modifications over time, thus producing improbable design that survives over multiple generations. Human social learners focus to a much greater degree than other non-human primates on the actual actions performed by others, process copying, not just the results produced on the environment, product copying. So what he's identifying there is perhaps a key difference in human social learning compared with other species, and saying that this may be closely linked to why we see this kind of cumulative property of human cultural evolution. Likewise, perhaps an even stronger quote below from Mike Tomasello, saying that cumulative cultural evolution depends on imitative learning and perhaps active instruction on the part of adults, and cannot be brought about by means of weaker forms of social learning such as local enhancement and emulation learning. Now, these processes of local enhancement and emulation learning were widely recognised to be seen in other species as well, whereas it was the supposedly more complex social learning processes of imitation and teaching that were believed to be possibly more restricted, maybe even unique to humans. So that was at the time kind of the dominant idea about why we might see cumulative culture in humans but not other species. So it was very useful at the time to have ideas like this, clear statements like this to work from, because that allowed us to design the experiment in such a way so we could actually investigate this. So for example, the focus on what's different between humans and non-human humans being specifically about copying of actions meant that that was something that we could quite easily experimentally manipulate. We could simply ensure that that participants in our experiments were either exposed to social information about others' actions or not, as the case may be. That was fairly simple to implement as an experimental manipulation. So indeed, that was what we did, and Edu already gave you a little sort of teaser of the results that we found here. So essentially, in this particular study, which we ran using the paper aeroplane method, that was the easiest one for separating out these sort of sources of information. We ran various different conditions where the participants had access to 3 different forms of social information in a variety of different combinations. So in completing this paper aeroplane task, essentially, potentially participants could be learning from others' actions. So you could be watching other participants actually building their paper aeroplane and learning, the actual construction process, which was something that was emphasized as being very important in some of these ideas about human cumulative culture. You could also learn something from the results. So obviously in our previous study, participants had been able to see the completed products. They had also been given the information about flight distances. So participants actually knew which designs were effective and which ones weren't. And finally, information was available in the form of teaching. So we'd allowed our participants to communicate with one another. In fact, we'd encouraged them to do that. And so some information was presumably getting exchanged that way, and participants were actually saying, oh, this worked or this didn't. In this experiment, we wanted to separate those out much more cleanly. So we ran experiments where participants either did or didn't have access to these various sources of information in various different combinations. So essentially, to cut quite a long story short, as Edu said, what we found, which surprised us really at the time, was that we found evidence of this cultural accumulation across all of these different conditions. So it didn't really matter what form of social information the participants were exposed to. Essentially, they were able to work with whatever they had, even if that was just actions or just results or just information from teaching. They were still able to use that in order to generate this cumulative effect and for later generations to be able to perform better than earlier ones. And that was really interesting, of course, and it did seem to contradict some of these ideas that were around at the time about imitation in particular being critical for cumulative culture, because we were finding that actually it wasn't. You didn't even need to necessarily observe the process or observe the actions to see this effect for this task. So what we concluded from that study was that imitation and teaching aren't strictly necessary for cumulative culture. But I think what's important to emphasize there is that that really isn't the same as saying that these things aren't important or that they're never used, because I don't think that's the case at all. I think these mechanisms are important and they certainly are used in some contexts. And in fact, we subsequently followed up that study to ask that very question, because one of the things that we were particularly interested in was the idea that actually, depending on the task that you're looking at, that will actually determine the transmission requirements. So in looking at that paper aeroplane task in particular, this was something that was relatively straightforward for the participants to, if you like, reverse engineer from the finished product. So they could see these completed aeroplanes, and perhaps that was enough for that particular task in order for them to reproduce what they needed to generate this cumulative cultural effect. That was not necessarily going to be the case for every behaviour. For things that were much more complex or much harder to reverse engineer. So yeah, we were interested in following up this question of, okay, well, actually, if we directly manipulate this property of how easy or difficult it is to kind of reverse engineer a cultural trait, does that impact directly on the transmission requirements, on the mechanisms that are needed in order to transmit that behaviour effectively? So what we used to look at that question was some behaviours that we could say, well, in many respects, these behaviours are comparable, but we can actually test out a variable of kind of complexity, a variable of how difficult it is to kind of work out how to do that thing just from looking at the finished product. So we looked at learning knot tying, and we were able to use several different knot designs, some of which we were able to classify as simple knots. That's because They were made up of a small number of steps. They could be completed in a smaller number of steps, and with a lower variety of steps, and compare those to knots that had a larger number of steps and a greater variety of steps, which we were proposing to be more complex and much harder to reverse engineer, and that might require things like process copying or possibly even teaching in order to be transmitted effectively. So in order to look at this question, the specific knots that we compared were the two that you can see at the top, which we classified as being the simple knots, and the two that you can see at the bottom here, which we classified as being the more complex knots. And so the three different transmission conditions that we looked at, and I think it's important to emphasize here, so this wasn't a transmission chain design, so we didn't look over multiple generations here. We were just interested in a single generation of transfer, and unlike the studies with the paper airplanes and the spaghetti towers, where we were looking where the initial participants were given no information whatsoever and they had to kind of work out how to approach the task. This was very different in that we were giving them the solution and seeing how well that solution was retained. So very different kind of study. But nonetheless, what we were interested in here was just really that question of transmissibility, how well something can be transmitted. So we just looked at the single generation of a specific trait. But we looked at the transmission of these traits under three different transmission conditions. So one in which participants were simply exposed to the end state. So they saw an example of the completed knot and a picture of the completed knot, and they just had to try and tie the knot for themselves. An intermediate states condition, which allowed us to tap into this idea of sort of process information. So what participants were given here was a set of step-by-step instructions that kind of walked them through the process of completing the knot. These materials were taken from a website about knots that included these instructions about how to tie each knot. So we were able to take those step-by-step instructions from that website. Finally, we looked at a teaching condition where participants were actually paired with another individual who had themselves mastered that knot and so was in a position to actually provide feedback or actively demonstrate the process of knot tying. And so what we expected was that for these more complex knots, more information would be better, essentially, and those would be much better transmitted in the kind of process information and teaching conditions compared with the end states. Whereas for the simple knots, there would be less of a difference, and these would be transmitted fairly effectively under all conditions. And what we found, sure enough, was for the knot that you can see at the end there, which in fact is the trucker's hitch knot, so that was one of the more difficult knots. That was in the teaching condition, all participants were able to successfully tie that knot, and it was sort of half and half in the process copying condition, and in the end state condition then most of the participants were able to tie some part of the knot, but not many of them sort of completed it fully. The effect was much more striking even for the second knot that we've got there, the second difficult knot. For this one, it was only participants that were assigned to this teaching condition that were actually able to successfully tie this knot. So in the other two conditions, process information and end states, participants only ever got as far as kind of partially tying the knot in those conditions. That was really different from the simple knots, where we found that basically we were finding more or less a ceiling effect across the board for both of those two knots. So participants were able to successfully tie those knots no matter what information they were exposed to. And so we felt this was a really neat demonstration of the fact that essentially the transmission requirements are going to depend on the task, really. So I hope that reinforces the point that although we came to the conclusion that imitation and teaching aren't necessary for cumulative culture, it isn't the same as saying that they're not important or they're not used. It just means that essentially having limited capacities for action copying in non-humans, that shouldn't in principle preclude the existence of cumulative culture. So although humans may use our capacities for action copying in certain contexts, that doesn't explain why we don't see it in non-humans, basically. It doesn't rule it out. So that leads me to really the next part of the talk, where I want to talk about this idea about the potential for cumulative culture in non-humans and to what extent it is possible. So if it's not precluded, then to what extent do we see it and in what contexts? And so I'll tell you a little bit about some of the recent kind of experimental demonstrations of cumulative culture in animals. It's nice that Andy talked specifically about the bighorn sheep example, because I thought about putting that one in as another example of a sort of recent demonstration of something that looks like pretty good evidence of cumulative culture in non-humans. And I'd actually decided perhaps I don't have time to talk about that one, and I'll focus more on the experimental studies rather than the observational ones. So that worked out beautifully, because Andy's spoken about that one as well. So you already know about the example from the bighorn sheep and the moose and this green wave surfing behaviour, which is really interesting. The one that I want to talk about, because it links in sort of most closely with the work that I've done in the lab with human participants, is one that came out in 2017, actually studying the behaviour of homing pigeons. And this was an experimental study, really nice study, carried out by Taka Sasaki and Dora Bairo. Essentially, they based their designs somewhat on some of the experimental designs that we had used with the adult human participants. So creating chains of pigeons in which they were creating this generational succession aspect, or simulating this generational succession by removing the most experienced member and replacing them with a new naive individual. The behaviour that they were specifically looking at was the efficiency of the routes taken by these homing pigeons. So obviously for the homing pigeons, what they're trying to do is trying to get from the release site to their homing location as efficiently as possible. So essentially we can safely assume that for the pigeons, a more efficient route is better, essentially. That's what they want to do. They want to get home as efficiently as possible. So what the researchers were interested in was whether the routes became more efficient over generations, and whether better routes were getting preferentially transmitted, so that later generations of pigeons were perhaps able to take advantage of more efficient routes that had been learned by these previous generations in a cumulative way over a number of generations. So they ran these chains of pigeons, and the key detail here is the pigeons were released as pairs. And what happens when the homing pigeons are released together and they're heading to the same site is they will fly together, so they will share a route together. So in this way, the naive individuals who are joining a more experienced individual were able to get the benefit of any more efficient route that had been learned. Because they were flying with this more experienced individual. And each pair was released, I think, 12 times successively together before that most experienced individual was removed and replaced by a new naive individual. And what they found was the routes taken by the sort of final pairs in the chain were actually more efficient than the routes taken by the initial pairs. So this was really good evidence that these learning benefits had actually accumulated over multiple generations in the homing pigeons. We've also been interested in looking at this experimentally in non-human primates. So again, actually, somewhat similar to what the researchers had done with the pigeons, almost trying to kind of manipulate a situation so that we can elicit a cumulative culture-like effect experimentally. As I mentioned at the outset, I'm going to have to drift into talking about things in slightly more vague terms because I'm going to be talking about unpublished work. But I can tell you about one study that we've just had coming out recently, which kind of underpins some of the work that we're doing on this topic. But essentially, what we're finding is that it is in principle possible to kind of demonstrate an accumulation of benefits through social transmission in the learning of non-human primates. We're just basing that simply on associative learning of cues associated with reward and cues associated with the absence of reward, and the way that that learning can be used to then kind of accumulate behaviours that are kind of increasingly rewarded over multiple generations of transmission. So this work has been carried out with squirrel monkeys and also capuchin monkeys at the Living Links to Human Evolution Research Centre at Edinburgh Zoo, of which Andy Whiteman was formerly the director, and he was responsible for the setup of this facility, for getting the funding to start it up in the first place. It's a fantastic facility. As you can see here, the way that it works is the monkeys have a really, really nice outdoor enclosure. The squirrel monkeys and the capuchin monkeys are actually housed together in these big outdoor enclosures. They can choose to enter these testing cubicles if they want to take part in studies, where we can, if we need to, separate them off from other individuals. They can tell us if they want to leave, so they can push on a door to say, I want to get back into the enclosure now, at which point they're released back into the group. But usually we find they quite like taking part in studies, so they enter these testing cubicles voluntarily and take part in our studies. The individual you can see here is Donna Keane, my PhD student, who is working with, I think, one of the capuchin monkeys there, presenting our task on a touch screen, so one of the monkeys in the Living Links facility. So the study that has just come out recently from some of the work that we've been doing on this topic was actually a study with squirrel monkeys. So this has just come out in Peer J. It was work led by my postdoc, Liz Renner. And as I said, what we're doing in the work that we're doing with non-human primates is simply training them to associate certain cues with reward and certain cues with absence of reward, and seeing to what extent we can use that to then generate a kind of cumulative culture-like effect in their learning. So this represents essentially a very early step in the process of getting towards that stage. So what we wanted to do initially was simply train up the monkeys on a kind of win, stay, lose, shift behaviour based on social information use. So using a couple of different modalities, we tried this out using a kind of object choice format and also a touchscreen format. We would expose the monkeys to information about either where a reward was or where it wasn't, and then the monkey would be required to make a choice. Essentially, as I say, so we did this using sort of physical objects. We also did it using this more abstract touchscreen version. We didn't find a huge amount of difference in terms of the modality, in terms of the performance of these of the monkeys. But the idea behind it is that essentially monkeys can outperform whatever demonstration they're exposed to if they sort of follow a win, stay, lose, shift strategy. So if they reproduce, if they sort of reselect stimuli that appear to be rewarded, then they sort of get the benefits. And if they can avoid any stimuli that appear to be unrewarded, then in fact they can perform better than the demonstration. So as I say, that's already published, so you can read about how far we got with the squirrel monkeys. I have to say, with the squirrel monkeys, the answer was not particularly far. So we're not pursuing the cumulative culture question at the moment with the squirrel monkeys, but we did have much better success with the capuchin monkeys with this task. And we are pursuing the question of how far we can push a cumulative culture-like effect in the capuchin monkeys at the moment. That's basically taking what we've taught these animals about cues to reward and cues to absence of reward, and then using that on a more complex task with a graded reward structure where they can either find multiple rewards or not, so they can actually properly outperform a demonstration that they've been exposed to, in the sense that they can actually find more rewards within a stimulus array than they were shown if they're sort of correctly applying a kind of win, stay, lose, shift rule. So But based on that kind of work and some of the other studies that have been coming out with non-humans, such as the homing pigeon study and the ungulate study that Andy's already told you about, essentially what we think now is that there really is nothing in principle preventing cumulative culture in non-human species. In all likelihood, we will start to find evidence of it in more and more contexts. It probably is there. Nonetheless, I think it's undeniable that cumulative culture occurs in a much wider range of contexts in humans than in other species. And I think actually that point is underlined even by the result I've already talked about with this paper airplane study, where we found this cumulative effect regardless of the social information that participants were actually exposed to. So as I've already said, it sort of didn't really matter what social information participants had access to. They were able to work with whatever they had. So if they had information about actions, they could use that. If they had information about results, they could use that. If they had information from others in the form of teaching, they could use that. I think that flexibility of use of social information is probably very different from the examples that we're seeing in non-humans. So, for example, with the studies with humans, we were able to just kind of pick two tasks. We just were able to pick, okay, we'll do paper airplanes and we'll do spaghetti towers. Oh, look, we're getting a similar phenomenon out of both of these tasks. And I think there's all sorts of other things we could have chosen that would have identified similar effects as well. And indeed, this work has been followed up by lots of other studies by researchers from other research groups, finding similar effects using different tasks, using things like basket building or boat building and things like that, finding similar results to ours. I don't think that's what we would find in these non-human examples if we tried to extend to other contexts. So just because we can identify a cumulative culture-like effect in the kind of root deficiencies of homing pigeons, I don't think that means that if, for example, the pigeons were learning nest-building behaviour or something like that, that they would be able to engage in sort of a cumulative culture of their nest-building behaviour. Just because we see it in this example of root learning. Because I think the example of the homing pigeons, obviously that depends critically on the fact that the birds do engage in this flocking behaviour. So the pair fly together, and that generates that heritability of the root without the pigeons, if you like, needing to know that they're using the social information in order to do that. They kind of get the benefits of that more efficient route simply as a kind of epiphenomenon of the flocking tendency. Likewise, with the work that we're doing with primates, obviously, essentially we're training them to respond to these cues. So if we suddenly present them with a completely different task, even though we've been able to elicit, perhaps a cumulative culture-like effect using the cues that we've trained them on, if we suddenly expose them to something very different, I'm not sure how well that will generalize. So really what we're interested in now is asking questions about, for example, the limits on the potential for cumulative culture in both non-human animals and also in young children, because I think that's a key group for understanding what might be underpinning what adult humans are doing when they engage in cumulative culture. And also understanding why it is that we see a much broader scope of kind of application of cumulative culture in adult humans. So just to talk again quite briefly about what we're finding in these comparative and developmental approaches to looking at limits on cumulative culture. Once again, this is unpublished work, so I'm just going to have to sort of give you quite vague details about it at the moment. So for investigating limits on cumulative culture using comparative approaches, we can use these task paradigms that we've come up with. Because it's quite an arbitrary task, we can manipulate features of that task to look at what actually influences the extent to which we can find a cumulative culture effect. When do things like, for example, sheer memory loads start to interfere with the extent to which we can elicit that effect? So these are the questions that we're interested in asking in some of the research that we're doing with non-human primates at the moment. but they're also underpinning some of the work that we're doing with young children as well. So this is my PhD student, Charlotte Wilkes here. She's been carrying out logically similar studies with young children. So looking at how the scope of cumulative culture broadens as children get older. So looking at age-related changes in the breadths of context in which we can see the potential for cumulative culture across tasks in similar ways to how we're approaching the research with non-human primates. So really, my group at the moment are essentially addressing this final question of explaining the breadth of scope of human cumulative culture. Why is it that we do just seem to engage in cumulative culture so much more pervasively? And I can tell you about some work that we have published on this, although this is a theoretical paper, but this paper kind of gives the theoretical underpinnings to a lot of the empirical work that we're doing at the moment. So this is my PhD student Juliet Dunstone, who is first author on a literature review that we've written on the topic of looking at human metacognitive abilities and how they might facilitate cumulative culture, and the ways in which human metacognitive abilities might influence not just how we use social information, but also how we share social information. So human understanding not just of what we know ourselves, but also what others know, and how that can potentially revolutionise social information use and social information sharing. That's obviously all very well to say in practice, but of course we do need some evidence to show that these things are actually making a difference, and there are changes in how, for example, human adults are engaging in social information use. These are questions that we're following up empirically at the moment. So one of the things that we're looking at critically is kind of developmental changes in how we engage in social information use and social information sharing. So essentially, in a lot of contexts, we think that that humans, including in social learning contexts, humans recognise the sort of potential value of others' behaviour as a source of information, and that might be really key to understanding how we're engaging in social information use and when we're deciding to copy and what mechanisms we're employing when we're doing that. Although there is evidence of some kind of metacognitive understanding in non-humans, some of this research is still quite controversial, and the kinds of metacognitive abilities that have been demonstrated in non-humans still roughly correspond to kind of what we see in children of about age kind of 2. So they still represent relatively basic abilities in terms of what we see in young children. Whereas actually a much more sophisticated metacognitive understanding appears to develop quite late in young children. So for example, children's understanding of what type of evidence is required to resolve a specific uncertainty, that only seems to develop around age 4 or 5, just to give one example. So we're following up these questions in looking at developmental changes in how children use social information and how children share social information. So my PhD student, Kirsten Blakey, has been addressing the first question, and my PhD student, Gemma McIntosh, has been investigating the second one. And both of them have completed nice sets of studies, both of which demonstrate that there are some significant changes in how children go about using social information and sharing social information, and these happen relatively late. So we're seeing important shifts in use of social information and sharing of social information in children as old as 7, 8, 9, and 10. And we think those shifts might be really important, and they may be things that represent capacities that are not matched in non-humans. And I'm sorry, I can't tell you more about it. I'd like to, but of course, it's my PhD students' work, and what's most important of all is kind of protecting their ability to publish that work. So if it was just mine, I might tell you about it, but it's not that simple, and it's theirs. So I think you'll just have to wait and see the details of some of those studies another time, I think. Essentially, what I want to conclude is that cumulative culture does seem to be particularly pervasive in humans, but I personally don't believe it is precluded in non-humans. I suspect in some of the research that we're doing at the moment seems to back up the idea that human metacognitive abilities, those that allow us to reason about both our own mental states and those of others, may be what kind of broadens out the context in which we see cumulative culture in humans compared with non-humans. So finally, just want to say thank you to everyone who's currently working in my lab and everyone that's contributed to the past work. Thanks also to our funders and the institutions that have helped support our data collection. And thank you very much to all of you for listening.
We have time for questions.
Hi. Congratulations for your talk. It's a great talk. Well, I have a few questions, so I try to just make one about sometimes when I see studies on cumulative culture in other animals, I wonder about the difference between the cumulativeness of these cultures, animal cultures, and the cumulativeness in humans. And I'm thinking, for example, for the studies with the birds, I forgot the name of the birds. I don't know. But when you see the transmission of between the birds of the trajectories that they can take to arrive to a certain location.
The pigeons, yeah.
Yeah, the pigeons. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I was thinking about doves. I don't know why. So pigeons, yeah.
Really,
so the pigeons, yeah. So when you think about it, I think about some sort of optimization of trajectories. But when we think about humans, we increase in complexity. Our culture is cumulative in the sense that we have more complex artifacts or more complex social practices. So how do you see that when we compare humans and non-humans in terms of cumulativeness of culture?
Yeah, I think that's a really key question. And some researchers have kind of come down on saying, so complexity therefore should be part of the defining criteria of cumulative culture because of that, because what we're seeing in animals seems to be so very different. And I completely agree with you, that kind of movement towards something that's kind of optimal by, if you like, just simply averaging out errors and converging on something optimal seems very, very different than this kind of increasing movement away towards something that becomes increasingly improbable, if you like. I think it's quite important that we don't get confused about thinking that complexity has to be part of cumulative culture, because I think in a lot of cases in human cumulative culture, actually, we want to get rid of complexity sometimes. So yes, complexity is sometimes the result, but it's not what we're going for, you know? So in a lot of cases, actually, things might get quite complex, but then you might find a more efficient solution that solves that same problem in a less complex way. That's actually preferred. So I think it's quite important that we avoid incorporating that as a defining characteristic. But I do think that it's a key issue that we separate out these cases where repeated social transmission takes us towards something that is more kind of reflective of a sort of basic default behaviour, if you like, versus things that take us to something that's increasingly improbable, increasingly hard to learn. I think with the pigeon route learning, it's probably the case that the most efficient routes are also really easy to learn. And I think what we see in most examples of human cumulative culture is probably the opposite, as the things that are invented later are probably harder to learn. So, you know, these complex garment construction techniques or food preparation techniques, they probably are really hard to learn, but they're also really useful. So that gives us the motivation to overcome that difficulty of learning. So I agree that's a really important detail, and I think and once again, to me, I would see it as something that means that actually that human motivation to use social information, to go, okay, there's a thing I need to learn, and I need to learn it from somebody else, and that might be effortful, and I might need to find the right person, and I might need to concentrate on learning it. You kind of need a bit of that metacognitive understanding, I think, to get over the fact that the things you're learning are really, really hard rather than getting increasingly easy. But I think it's a really important distinction, and I think we even see it in examples of human cultural evolution where some things are transmitted and they kind of catch on and become pervasive just because they're easy to learn, and we're not kind of learning them in that sort of deliberate, intentional way. I think some of the examples in language evolution experiments, for example, perhaps capture that sort of same thing. Really, really good question, and definitely agree on that point. There's a key difference there.
Hi. Here. Hello. Thank you for your talk. And I had a question. When you were talking about cumulative culture in kids, I was wondering if you considered studying spontaneous play in school, for example, and to see how they create cumulative culture there. I've been studying capuchin monkeys for a while, and we study social learning and social influences on learning, on manipulative behavior, and we do it in the field, and we try to create how to do that without being in the lab. Mm-hmm. And then we also have some people from our lab here, Juliana, for example. She studies small kids, and they have described something that we call microculture of play, which kids create and then repeat throughout the interactions, everyday interactions. And so I was wondering if you do something like that. What do you think about it?
It's a great idea. We haven't done anything like that, but that does sound really interesting. I think just because we've been more focused on these questions of like pinning down mechanisms and stuff, it usually suits us to have these more kind of pre-planned experimental designs. But I can totally see that there's questions that you could get at through those more observational techniques, which we can get at using our approaches. So I agree. That's really interesting. And I'd really like to hear about the work that you're doing on these play microcultures. It sounds really, really interesting. So I'd like to talk to you about it later if you've got time. So
Thank you for your talk. So it seems that we have been overemphasizing the role of imitative learning and active instruction, right? So would that be the same case for the role of high fidelity transmission for cumulative culture?
Well, so my answer to that would be the same as the answer really about the mechanisms, in that it depends. So for some things we'll need really high fidelity, and for other things not so much. And likewise with the transmission mechanisms, I think that really does depend. So yes, I would say there's probably been a bit of an overemphasis on imitation specifically as a mechanism, because I don't think we always do need that unless it's something where really the fine detail and the process and the actions really, really matter. But as regards teaching, I think that actually is pretty important for transmitting a lot of things. And it comes back a bit to the question from earlier about human cultural transmission, and it tending to take us in directions where the behaviour actually becomes increasingly improbable and increasingly hard to learn. So as far as I'm concerned, what that means is those traits also tend to become increasingly dependent on, for example, support from teaching and somebody actually saying, you won't learn this correctly unless you do this. You'll make the obvious mistake. There are things that you will do, and unless I tell you, don't do that, do this, focus really carefully on this detail, you're going to get it wrong. I think actually teaching is really, really important. And I mentioned just at the end there the work that my student Gemma McIntosh has been doing on sharing of social information. And as I say, that kind of really knowing what someone else might need to know and predicting really well, this is what will help them learn this behaviour. If I've got a really limited opportunity to say, right, okay, you've got to learn this thing, this is the key detail that I'm going to tell you to help you learn it. We're finding that's a really late development. That's not something that comes easy to kids at all. So I think that's really, really important for supporting these traits that become increasingly complex and increasingly hard to learn. With high fidelity transmission, as I say, I really do think it's entirely context dependent. Sometimes we need to be focused on fidelity and sometimes not so much. And the important thing is actually being able to make that judgment, whether on the part of the teacher or the part of the learner. That answers your question.
Hello, Christine. Thank you very much for the talk. I really like the topic. I was thinking about whether you take into account in your research, in your experiments, whether you take into account individual differences, such as sex, for example, of the teacher and the imitator, and if there is some kind of influence, because there's some actually few studies that I know that there is some influence of competency on learning abilities of children, for example, that they learn more from adults who appear to be more competent, for example. And also when I started my research during undergraduation with parrots, we were trying to use this method of Irene Pepperberg to teach them words, human words, and actually sentences, and we were quite unsuccessful. But actually, after a long time of trainings, we actually perceived that the parrots were only learning from human males for some reason, which we don't know why. But anyway, so I wanted to ask you whether you actually collect this kind of data, whether there is some kind of evidence for individual differences in social learning and implications for evolutionary processes in learning and cumulative culture. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so some of the time we do look and typically in most of the studies that we're doing, we don't find much evidence of differences. Obviously, sometimes, some studies of kids have identified things like model-based biases, work that Rachel's been involved in, for example. One of the things that actually we've been really interested in, so my student Kirsten, who I talked about at the end there, when we were looking at children starting to identify appropriate sources of social information, one of the things we incorporated into that study was the possibility that they could be thrown off by using model-based biases, so manipulating demonstrator characteristics as well, and looking at what age they were transitioning from relying on that kind of rule of just copying an individual of the same gender or copying an adult or whatever it might be, to actually making the right choice about, this person has the information that I need. We found exactly as we hoped, essentially, that the younger children were much more driven by these biases and preferring to watch same gender demonstrators, whereas the older children knew what they were trying to do and were choosing a demonstrator on the basis of who had the right information. So I think that perhaps helps us understand a bit why in some of the other tasks that we've done with adult human participants, for example, we've not found so much evidence of these kind of model-based biases, because people have been much more focused on just the task. And we don't really find much evidence that there's differences between males and females in terms of how good they are at paper airplane building or spaghetti spaghetti tower building or whatever, or or who's a particularly effective model in these situations, as far as we can tell. And I think that is just because people are much more task focused, and that's just much more pervasive than the potential for these model-based biases to be driving things.
Thank you. I don't think we have more time for questions because we have to feed our speakers and be back at 2. So then we have 2 more exciting lectures by Dr. Legard that just arrived, Christine Legard, then Rachel Kendall, and afterwards, by the posters, just let you know that we have some sandwiches and juice to feed the conversation among you after the session, so you can have any further questions to the speakers or among yourselves. And talking about among yourselves, please pay attention to the poster announcement about young, early career researchers in the field, because Natalia Dutt is trying to organize a communications group with you guys that trying to get into the field. So please be back at 2. They'll have 2 more exciting questions, exciting talks to go.